What would happen if the Austrians were allowed to unite with the Germans in the aftermath of the Great War? Austria would soon become a state within the German Republic. This solution would escalate further as the French and Italians would officially recognize the Rhenish and Austrian republics. Philip Pétain would, with the support of the far right and loyal military men, stage a coup, and they soon would have found the Latin axis together, as well as Britain and Germany allying with each other. Once Japan had invaded the USSR, the alignment of the Japanese was set. The Japanese were now a member of the Saxon Allies. The previously neutral United States was in an uproar and promptly declared war on the Japanese, a member of the Saxon Allies, leading the United States of America to become a member of the Latin Axis. The Great War ravaged Europe, and the terrible living conditions in the German Empire led to the Germans surrendering to the Allies. Soon afterwards, several extensive treaties were signed in order to establish an everlasting peace in Europe. This included several major territorial concessions, war reparations, and the war guilt onto Germany. While the conditions of these treaties were harsh, the American president, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, had many Germans interpreting the wording to mean that the lands where Germans lived would all be under one state. This would therefore mean that the lands of Austria would become members of the new German Republic. This led me to wonder, what would happen if the Austrians were allowed to unite with the Germans in the aftermath of the Great War? How would this affect interwar Germany? How would the Entente react? Come join me as we explore this timeline together. In order to allow Austria to unite with Germany, we would need to have an alternate Treaty of Saint-Germain. While the Versailles Treaty was the most famous of all the post-war treaties, there were several other treaties that handled the destinies of the other Central Powers. This included Austria, who at the time of the ratification of this treaty was styling itself as the Republic of German Austria. The Entente were specifically wishing to secure their position in Europe and never allow their former enemies to grow strong enough to cause another conflict, so the concept of allowing Austria to unite with Germany was absurd, so it was strictly denied in our Treaty of Saint-Germain. However, in this timeline, I would need to ensure that the outcome of the Treaty of Saint-Germain was different. In this timeline, we will have Woodrow Wilson directly involved in the Treaty of Saint-Germain, and, in his intervention, allow the Austrians to unite with Germany. This point of divergence is, admittingly, weak, as we cannot truly guarantee that Wilson was wanting to adhere to his 14 points strictly. However, we could assume that Wilson would fear the results of selectively applying his principles, so he demands that Austria be allowed to ascend into Germany. In order to ease the fears of the Entente, all claimed territories of the Czechs, Italians, and Yugoslavians would be conceded to them, while also forcing Austria to remain demilitarized in the same way that the Rhineland was. Also, for fun, let's have Vorarlberg be annexed into Switzerland. In our timeline, the westernmost province of Austria, Vorarlberg, had an election to decide whether they should stay a part of Austria or join Switzerland as a canton. The vote actually went in favor of Switzerland, but due to the outcome of Saint-Germain, this too was denied by the Western powers. Due to the insistence that Austria unite with Germany, you will have the other great powers agreeing to Swiss expansion, with the compromise just barely succeeding. Austria would soon become a state within the German Republic. This alternate outcome of the treaty would be extremely controversial. Italy would be incredibly concerned with the admittance of the Austrians to the German Republic, further buying into the mutilated victory narrative. This idea of a mutilated victory would soon ripple into the consciousness of the French, who would see American intervention in the post-war peace to be, at best, incredibly misguided, and at worst, a grand conspiracy which the Americans were seeking to dominate the world. While many in Germany were satisfied with the compromises which led to Austrian ascension to Germany, there were many citizens who feared the German Republic would soon oppress their regional cultures and way of life. Several Rhinish Germans feared that Prussian dominance in their regional politics would soon lead to the industrious Rhinish to be subjected to Prussian militarism and its horrors. This led to Rhinish nationalists seeking to secede from the German Republic and become an independent state. The movement was supported by the French government, as they saw the benefit of having a large buffer state along their border that would be extremely economically dependent on them. In this timeline, the idea of separating away from the Berlin-dominated Weimar Republic would also gain traction in Austria. Austrian nationalist movements would begin to organize and gain support from the French and Italian governments, who would fear the potential of a unified Germany. This solution would escalate further as the French and Italians would officially recognize the Rhinish and Austrian republics, leading to minor border conflicts. The NSDAP and their leader, Adolf Hitler, attempted to take over Bavaria and then spread his revolution to all of Germany. However, his attempt would be swiftly put down by local police. Hitler would remain in prison until his trial, which would happen at a much later date. Tensions continued to rise, with many fearing the reprisal of war in Europe. Due to this, the League of Nations convened to settle the conflict between Germany and their European adversaries. The conference would result in the French occupational forces being withdrawn from the Rhine, German accession into the League of Nations, and the support of partisan organizations to immediately cease. The outcome of the League of Nations solution thoroughly humiliated France, and solidified the French General Republic's distrust of the West. As French nationalists began to become more and more paranoid, they turned to Mussolini's new 20th century ideology of fascism. Mussolini had successfully taken over in Italy just before the situation in Germany nearly boiled over into war, and they had, as it seemed to many, managed to avoid a crippling general strike through their policies. While the reality was much more grim, this perceived success of the new ideology led to many French nationalists to adopt the ideology for themselves. After the French and Italians nearly arbitrated another war between themselves and Germany, the Germans were incredibly relieved to have their nation properly respected. The League of Nations had, in Germany's view, properly achieved its goals of preserving peace in the world, and had treated the young republic with the respect of an equal rather than a subjugated power. This, on top of the Austrian accession into Germany, would diminish the political strength of the far-right and far-left organizations within the state. While the strain of war reparations on the economy would still cause hyperinflation and general dissatisfaction, the Dawes Plan would alleviate pressure on the state and would cement Germany as a strictly democratic nation. Due to this shift of loving democracy, when Hitler was put on trial for his treasonous acts against the Republic, he was given no quarter and sentenced to life in prison. There would be no leniency towards Hitler's verdict, and he would spend the rest of his life rotting in prison. While the NSDAP would be headless, the threats towards democracy in Germany were not gone completely. Prussian militarists and aristocrats would continue to attempt their perversions of the state. This would lead to Konrad Adenauer, a Rhinish Catholic, to come to power as chancellor and attempt to alleviate the concerns which had led to the political crisis in 1923. Thus, in 1930, the German Republic would break apart the Prussian state into smaller regions to grant the people of these regions representation. This reform was incredibly popular in the Rhineland and alleviated the concerns of Prussian domination in other smaller regions of the Federal Republic, but was thoroughly despised by the Prussian aristocracy. Only time would tell if the conservative elements of the military would stay loyal to the Republic or turn their backs on democracy. But for now, Germany was united and stable, albeit still recovering from hyperinflation and with a debilitated military.
An event which happened to France in real life, Alexandre Stavinsky was embezzling funds from the French government. He was found dead. His death was ruled a suicide, but many were skeptical. The right wing accused the left wing government of ensuring his death to avoid the implication of his governmental accomplices. Riots ensued, with 15 people dying as a result of riot-breaking procedures, while in our timeline, it would trigger a democratic transition of power towards a right-wing bloc. In this timeline, it would be a forceful one. Philippe Pétain would, with the support of the far right and loyal military men, stage a coup. The military dictatorship would soon proclaim a fourth republic. A large coalition of right-wing parties backed the new government, including Jacques Doriot of the PPF, François de Larac of the Cross of Fire, Marcel Boucard's Francist movement, Charles Maurras and the monarchist integralist Action Française, and Marcel Déat's neo-socialists. These leagues would all fight for influence as the aging figurehead of Pétain slowly lost control of the situation. The Fourth French Republic would pursue close relations with the Italian state, supporting their invasion of Ethiopia in the League of Nations, as well as revoking their guarantees towards Yugoslavia, which had been eyed by Italy and other ideologically aligned nations in the Balkans. During these developments in the French mainland, there was a boiling point with the Mandate of Syria. After the Great War, the French and British carved out their slices of the Fertile Crescent, as agreed upon within the Sykes-Picot Agreement. However, the League of Nations' mission of creating world peace and upholding ideals of self-determination led to the foundation of the Mandate system. A League of Nations mandate was a region that was supervised by a foreign power, but to be eventually granted full independence. The foreign power would administer these regions as civilizers, with the express purpose of eventually granting the regions independence. Functionally, however, these mandates were treated in the exact same way as colonies were, with different manners of speaking used to provide lip service to the League of Nations. This is absolutely the case in the Mandate for Syria and the Lebanon, the League of Nations mandate for the French-controlled regions of the Levant. During the French purview of the mandate, several governments were established, but were soon deposed by civilian unrest each time, mostly due to the heavy influence France had attempted to exert onto the people of Syria, in direct opposition of their supposed role of civilizers. The French behavior in the administration in Syria would not differ until the 1934 crisis, where the government of the Grand Coalition of the far-right leagues would come to power. While the Action Française League would be heavily interested in cementing French presence in the Levant, further establishing ties with the Lebanese Christians, there was a radical idea proposed by Marcel Déat. He and his neo-socialists wished to create a collaborationist regime in Syria to help advance their strategic interests in the region, and the perfect candidate would be one of their former adversaries, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. SSNP for short was, as its name suggests, a socialist and nationalist party. While in our timeline, a faction of the party would support the Third Reich, Nazism was thoroughly despised by its founder, Antoun Sade. Antoun Sade sought to establish a greater Syria along the lines of the old Assyrian empires, which encompassed the entirety of the Fertile Crescent. He also sought to secularize the state, seeing the various religions of the Fertile Crescent as tools for foreign powers to divide the Syrians. Antoun Sade and Marcel Déat shared similar political ideologies and aims, so the potential for a collaboration between these two was definitely plausible. Seeing the benefit of a greater Syrian ally in the region, Marcel would be installed as High Commissioner of the Levant by Pétain in 1935. This move was celebrated by the more reactionary leagues of the Grand Coalition, as the neo-socialists were certainly a black sheep among the nationalists, and having them far away from home would allow for the remaining mainland leagues to fight for influence among themselves. However, this action would have significant, unforeseen consequences for the leagues of France. With the meteoric rise of the far right in France and the warming of relations with the Italians, the idea of a Latin axis came to be between these two powers. With their shared linguistic family and similar cultures, they would be the founding members of a multilateral alliance which the world would eventually revolve around. However, there were still territorial conflicts between the French and Italians. France controlled Nice, Savoy, and the island of Corsica. These territories were considered to be a fundamental part of Greater Italy, and as Greater Italy was one of Mussolini's biggest ambitions, it would be the largest thorn in the side of a potential axis forming between France and Italy. While France and Italy would not be able to reconcile these territorial disputes, France would grant Italy Djibouti as well as Tunis, as these colonial territories were highly sought after by the Italians, but were not that meaningful to the French. With the colonial concessions of France, Italy was confident in France's intentions, and they soon would found the Latin Axis together. The military in Spain had attempted to coup the Republican government. This attempt by the Spanish to coup the Republic mirrored the efforts of France. However, they were not successful, and thus a civil war ensued between the nationalists and the Republicans. With the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, no doubt taking inspiration from France's successful far-right coup, the Italians and French would recognize and support Franco's nationalist government. Concerned by Franco-Italian political maneuvering, Germany and Britain would both covertly support the Spanish Republic alongside the Soviet Union. As fighting in the Spanish Civil War continued, instability in Yugoslavia caused the Italians to begin arbitrating for them and their allies' lands to be distributed to their rightful owners. Italy had assurances from Petain's France that they would support their arbitration towards Yugoslavia. Seeking to avoid a major conflict, Britain, Germany, France, and Italy would meet in Istria to peacefully redistribute Yugoslavian lands between Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Italy. Yugoslavia agreed, much to their dismay, to the redistribution of their territories. Chamberlain may have come back home with a piece of paper that said that there would be peace in our time, but the reality was that Germany and Britain could no longer deny that war was on the horizon. This led to Britain supporting German rearmament efforts, as well as Britain and Germany allying with each other in an attempt to deter the Franco-Italian designs on Europe. The news of the alliance between Germany and Britain reached France, and the anti-German rhetoric that was so popular during the Great War would soon re-emerge, with the Anglo-Saxons being included in their anti-German propaganda. Marcel Diat would eventually succeed in his gamble with Antoun Sadeh, creating a stable regime in Syria loyal to France, the Free State of Syria. Marcel Diat would gain a reputation as a master political operator. Through his gamble in Syria, he was able to stabilize the region, install a friendly and loyal government, and grant France the prestige of truthfully adhering to the principles of the League of Nations and their mandate system, causing unrest in the remaining Western powers' mandates, as they sought the same sort of treatment that the benevolent French state had given Syria. It's worth mentioning that the only reason this had been considered is due to the British and their actions regarding their Iraq mandate, so to claim that this is purely a French idea would be inaccurate. However, it would be promoted as such to the French populace. As recognition for his success in Syria, Marcel Diat and his neo-socialists skyrocketed in influence within the squabbling leagues of France. What was considered a black sheep of the leagues was soon revealed to be a wolf in sheep's clothing, as neo-socialism became more and more influential in the Fourth Republic. With the Spanish Civil War ending in 1939 with the nationalist Spanish victory, many feared that Franco would sign onto the Latin Axis. However, Franco would be hesitant to join the alliance. France and Italy began investing heavily into the Spanish reconstruction efforts. Despite the Italians' guarantee that their ambitions in the Balkans were resolved with the outcome of the Istria Conference, it was clear that there was a bold-faced lie, as on April 7, 1939, the Italians had subjugated the greater Albania that they had raised to prominence into a protectorate. With the annexation of Albania, Italy was able to further exert its military pressure into Yugoslavia. Realizing that Yugoslavia itself would either join the fascists or perish, the Yugoslavians were pressured to join the Axis. Shortly after its signing, Democratic elements within Yugoslavia executed a coup and overturned the signature. Italy soon declared war on the illegitimate Yugoslavian state. With Italian troop movements so close to their lands, Germany moved troops into Austria and the Rhineland. As the perfect casus belli, France and Italy both declared war on Germany for violating the Treaty of Versailles. Out of support for Yugoslavia, Germany and Britain joined the fight against France, Italy, and their allies.
After the outbreak of the Second World War, Germany quickly mobilized its entire army to march into the demilitarized zones. As Italian and French troops marched into Yugoslavian lands, they made significant progress in Slovenia and southern Austria. Things were looking dire, and they needed the Germans to supply their front as soon as possible. The German army quickly moved to establish a favorable front. The Italian objective was to quickly cut off the Germans' capability from linking up with their Yugoslavian allies by capturing Graz. Supported by local Austrian nationalists, the Italian forces marched into Klagenfurt as German loyalists fled to the nearby mountains to organize partisan resistance. After the Alps were secured, Dollfuss would re-establish the Austrian state. In our timeline, Dollfuss attempted to establish and solidify a one-party state modeled after Italian fascism in Austria. However, he was assassinated by Nazis during an attempted Anschluss. In this timeline, he was a key member of the Austrian resistance to Germany. After his party was banned following Germany's ascension into the League of Nations, he operated a government in exile supported by the Italians. Now that he's returned to his home of Austria after 15 years, he's dead set on establishing an Austrian state, whether it was independent or not. German forces quickly organized in Vienna as they prepared to march to Graz, where they would clash with Italian forces. The German troops managed to reach Graz first and heavily fortified the city, anticipating an Italian attack. Italian forces soon came into conflict with the Germans as the first major battle of the Second World War began. With the invasion of Yugoslavia, the Little Entente was meant to be triggered, but the other two members of the alliance, Romania and Czechoslovakia, did not join. The Little Entente was a multilateral alliance between Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, founded in 1920. Czechoslovakia was concerned regarding Germany's potential designs on the Sudetenland, and Romania's Prime Minister, Ion Antonescu, was favorable to the Latin Axis. Ion Antonescu was installed as the Prime Minister of Romania by the King Carol II. This appointment was forced with the significant rise of fascism in Romania, no doubt supported by the Latin Axis. Due to Ion's influence, Romania remained neutral in the Second World War, and Czechoslovakia followed suit. The Saxon Allies diplomats would struggle to reverse this course as Germany faced their greatest test that the Republic would endure. The French and their Rhinish separatist collaborators were able to quickly establish supply lines due to the demilitarization. German forces quickly fortified the banks of the Rhine as their best line of defense. As the French continued to attempt to cross the Rhine and consistently failed, they waited patiently for another opportunity to breach the German defenses. As the Italian army continued to attempt to capture Graz, and consistently failed to do so, the French army and air forces were ordered to quickly eliminate Yugoslavia once and for all, in order to free up French and Italian troops to move from Yugoslavia to support the South and North German invasions. Upon wind of this development, the Yugoslavian army and king quickly scuttled out of their homeland and traveled into Germany, where they would lead a government in exile. After the Yugoslavian troops had managed to retreat properly, the German forces evacuated Graz as the Saxon Allies moved back further to establish a more inland defensive line. In the now occupied lands of Yugoslavia, Croatian and Montenegrin states were set up as protectorates of Italy, while Serbia was established as a French puppet. The French wished to use Serbia's natural resources in order to fuel their war machine. Seeing the Germans and British consistently losing land to the Latin Axis, the Soviets gained confidence in their ability to reclaim their western territories. In 1919, the Soviets had attempted to invade Poland to spread their revolution to Europe. However, Poland had repelled the Soviet Union and managed to claim a significant amount of territory to their east. Now the Soviet Union had demanded this land to be conceded back to them. The Polish ultimately refused. Poland was then promptly invaded by the Soviets in 1940. With the Polish facing an invasion from the east, the Saxon Allies fumbled in how they were to respond.
British diplomat Neville Henderson and German diplomat Hans Adolf soon met with Soviet diplomat Molotov in regards to Soviet expansionism. Molotov had offered the Saxon Allies a deal: leave Poland to die, and the Soviets would transfer the former German territory of Poland to Germany. The remaining lands of Poland would become a forcibly neutral state, which would serve as a buffer along the German and Soviet Union. The deal was truthfully compelling, especially for Hans, who supported the German revanchism. The Saxon Allies continued to stall negotiations, wishing to see how the Soviets would perform against the Polish before acting. In reality, Stalin's designs were nowhere near as conservative as Molotov had let on. He and his supporters wished to claim all lands of the former Russian Empire, including the Baltics and Bessarabia. Molotov knew that there would be no deal with the Saxon Allies if he had revealed their true intentions. Instead, the Soviets would annex these territories one by one as the capitalists and fascists bled each other dry. After the Polish had attempted to sign a deal with the Saxon Allies, they soon turned to the Romanians. In our timeline, Poland and Romania had signed an alliance, promising each other to defend each of their countries from foreign aggression. However, the pro-Latin Axis government refused to provide Poland any support. The reality was that the Latin Axis had been continuously pressuring the Romanians to join their alliance, which was strictly anti-war with the Soviets. The fascist government of Ion Antonescu continuously collaborated with the designs of Paris and Rome. His king, Carol II, was personally amicable with the Allies. The division of the two leaders and their conflicting alignments would only continue to stall any proper united front from being established. As the French and Italian forces continued to attempt to take Vienna, a breakthrough was made when the Hungarian kingdom had ended their regency by electing the Duke of Austria, now King of Croatia, Prince Aimone de Savoia, to become King of Hungary. For decades, the kingdom was kingless, as the regent, Nicholas Horthy, continuously prevented any coronations, seeing them as a diplomatic tool in order to gain favor with another great power. In our timeline, the crown was almost given to the King of Romania, since if the Hungarian kingdom was also ruled by the King of Romania, the disputed region of Transylvania would be ruled under personal union, allowing Hungary to reunite with Transylvania in an admittedly pitiful way. Following the logic of the personal unification of Hungary with the lost territory of Transylvania, the Duke of Austria and the King of Croatia would become the King of Hungary. Thus, the Hungarians crowned Aimone King of Hungary under the name of István. Hungary had wasted no time in their collaboration with the Latin Axis, as the eastern flank of Vienna was underdefended. Hungarian forces, with Italian and French support, soon enveloped Vienna. The city was now completely surrounded, with no supply lines to reinforce the beleaguered defenders. With Hungary being admitted into the Latin Axis as a full member, the first nation to react was Romania. Now surrounded by powers aligned to the Latin Axis directly, it was soon apparent to them that they would be the next to be partitioned. Hungary would gain Transylvania, the Bulgarians would gain southern Dobruja, and the Soviets would gain Bessarabia. Carol II promptly dismissed Antonescu as prime minister and reappointed the pro-Allied prime minister of Gheorghe Tatarescu, requesting their ascension into the Saxon Allies. Carol II also declared his support for the Polish and joined the Second Soviet-Polish War against the Soviet Union. Once the Romanians had joined the Saxon Allies, the Polish were now included in the alliance. With the Hungarian and Austrian states closing in on their borders, Czechoslovakia had the direct concern of the Hungarians and Austrians invading their lands and joined the Saxon Allies as well.
As the Germans were being invaded on all sides, the British had their colonial empire at risk of destruction by the Latin Axis. Instead of the French Navy being on either the side of the British or forcibly neutralized, in this timeline, the French Navy is fighting the British Navy directly. This alone spells immense trouble for the British, as the home islands would be under constant threat of naval invasion from their enemies, just a pond away. This, on top of the risk of having the supply chain of Gibraltar, Malta, and Egypt being cut off by a Spanish invasion, meant that any naval warfare that the British would engage in would be defensive in nature. The Latin Axis were completely aware of their advantage.
They would attempt to quickly overwhelm the Middle Eastern forces of the Saxon Allies in order to establish a supply line to the isolated colony of Italian East Africa. Their hope was that if they managed to humiliate the British quickly enough, they would be able to enter the negotiating table with the threat of a unified Latin Axis invasion into the crown colony of India. On top of the threats to the British and their African colonies, they also faced a threat to their Asian colonies due to the ascendant power of Japan and their pan-Asian expansionist policy. The Japanese, in the same way as our timeline, invades Manchuria, leaves the League of Nations, and invades China soon afterward. The British support China through the Burma Road, fearing Japanese ambitions on their Pacific colonies. However, the war stalled in China. The Japanese were seeking to open a separate front, where they would be able to divide the Chinese armies and eventually complete their subjugation. The French in the Indo-Chinese colony were in a perfect position to station more troops, threatening southern China and its precious resources. The various British armies in the region had already staged their invasion of French Indochina in order to secure their position in Asia. So, the Japanese would invade Indochina as well. As British and Japanese troops scrambled to secure Indochina for themselves, the potential for a Japanese-British collaboration had emerged. While the Saxon Allies had been adamant in their support of the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, the stress that the British were under to defend their colonies with their navy stretched utterly thin was leading to a crisis where the British would need to have their naval forces deployed in too many places at once. And as the Soviet Union and the British were at war, the British feared that the Soviets would attempt to lead a series of invasions into their crown colony of India. The Japanese, too, were fearful of the Soviet Union, as the Soviets were yet another major supporter of the Kuomintang, and were showing signs of collaboration with the Latin Axis as well. An unthinkable proposal was conceived, where the British would stop the support of the Kuomintang, recognize the Japanese puppet government in Manchuria, and reinvite Japan into the League of Nations. If this proposal was to be accepted, the Japanese would have a blank check to subjugate Asia, besides the British and their allies' colonies, of course. Japan would stall negotiations to continue their occupation of northern Vietnam, opening a southern front with Chiang's Kuomintang, who seemed to be losing allies day by day. The French political scenario was mixed at home following the initial successes of the French in their war. The ascendant neo-socialists were continuing to become more and more prominent, and thanks to the Soviet Union's introduction into the Second World War on the Latin Axis side, many far-right members of France were beginning to accuse the neo-socialists of conspiracy. Before the rise of the Fourth French Republic under Pétain and the right-wing League's curfew, Marcel Déat and his core neo-socialists were members of the right wing of the Comintern. Marcel had abandoned international socialism for national socialism. Despite his early shift towards nationalism, many far-right traditionalists of the Action Française clique were mystifying Marcel's meteoric rise in their state, claiming that he was not a true nationalist. While the Leagues of the Cross of Fire, Francis Movement, and Action Française would bind together in an alliance of reactionism, the PPF under Jacques Doriot would join forces with Marcel's neo-socialists. This is because Jacques Doriot was formerly a communist as well. The squabbling leagues were now in complete deadlock, accusing each other of undermining the war effort and treason against France. The political instability would favor the Saxon Allies significantly, as foreign spies began supporting the French resistance, operating ever since the Pétain coup in 1935. However, the Saxon Allies would soon find that their once united resistance movement was shattered. The communist policy of resisting fascism was halted in favor of a united front against liberalism. This causes significant turmoil within the resistance. The previously united socialists were now split between socialist ideals and Stalinist loyalists, fighting amongst themselves as the liberals tried to claim leadership in the resistance in favor of the Saxon Allies. While this obviously strengthened the control that the Leagues had imposed upon the state, it was also fueling the fire of the reactionary Leagues immensely, as the communists that remained loyal to Stalin were now supporting the neo-socialists indirectly. Growing more and more concerned with the political environment of France, the reactionary Leagues would begin secret talk with Mussolini. Due to their shared concerns of the neo-socialists becoming more and more closer to Moscow, Mussolini and the reactionary Leagues would begin creating contingency plans in the event of France falling into communism. While these talks would not amount to any action, it laid the foundation for a potential coup following Marcel's ascension to leadership within France.
As the British desperately fought off the Latin Axis' invasion of the Middle East, the Eastern Front was extremely contentious. The Soviet army was not prepared for the sudden inclusion of the entirety of the German, Czechoslovakian, and Romanian forces backing the Polish. While each of these countries had their own internal issues which prevented their armies from operating at full capacity, the geopolitical advantage had quickly shifted to the Saxon Allies' favor. Supply lines that were initially scattered were soon replenished by the extensive railway networks that connected the eastern states to Germany and beyond. For example, while the Hungarian introduction to the Latin Axis had guaranteed encirclement of Vienna, the beleaguered Germans were suddenly capable of evacuating into friendly Czechoslovakia. Ironically, the Germans were now shielded by the fortifications that the Czechs had made to deter them. The Saxon allies had devised a defensive plan which preserved as many defensive positions as possible while considering their forces' capabilities. The conclusion was to, unfortunately, abandon southern Germany altogether, rely on Czechoslovakia and Germany's natural defenses in order to allow their forces to properly organize before staging a large counterattack. Naturally, this meant that the Saxon allies were afraid of overextending into the USSR. This gave the Soviets time to scramble their defenses together. After the Romanian king's decision to align Romania with the Saxon allies, the fascists who were formerly in power had gone insurrectionary, seeking to establish a fascist Romanian republic aligned with the Latin Axis. It was only a matter of time before Romania capitulated. Preparations for the government of exile were underway, as the Romanians were not anticipating their survival against the Latin Axis' onslaught. Due to the unwillingness of the British to commit too much of their navy to the Mediterranean, the Latin Axis were able to advance further and faster than the axis of our timeline. El Alamein soon fell, and the Franco-Italian forces were marching into the Nile Delta. On top of this, the Syrian National Republic was making gains against Britain and their Iraqi mandate in the Levant, with their forces rapidly approaching Jerusalem. It was then that the Saxon allies had achieved yet another windfall to their war effort, by having Turkey join the war on the Saxon Allies' side. In our timeline, Turkey remained neutral in the Second World War, despite the Axis and Allies providing significant pressure and extensive promises to the young nation. However, in this timeline, they joined the Allies. This is due to several reasons. The most important to note is the Syrian National Republic's claims on their land. Syria wished to round out the Greater Syria by gaining a strategic mountain border at the expense of Turkey. This was a considerable threat to Turkey, especially as they were already boarding the Latin Axis in Bulgaria and the Italian-controlled island of Rhodes. With promises of territorial gains among their former imperial borders, the Turkish joined the Saxon allies. This would then cascade into the Sadabat Pact triggering, as now 2 of the 4 signatories of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan were at war with the Latin Axis. These formerly neutral nations had now had their forces turned against the Latin Axis and the Soviet Union, calling for a righteous jihad against the atheistic forces oppressing their religious kin in Central Asia. With nearly all the Soviet Union's neighbors now facing them in open conflict, the Japanese smelt blood in the water and began an invasion against the Soviet Union. This then solidified the Kuomintang's alliance with the Soviets and Latin Axis, formally joining the alliance against the Saxon allies. Once Japan had invaded the USSR, the alignment of the Japanese was set. The Japanese were now a member of the Saxon allies.
In our history, Japan had never invaded the Soviet Union. This is due to many reasons, but we will only explore one of them, the Siberian divisions. While there was quite a sizable garrison left in Siberia by the Soviet Union in our timeline, in this alternate timeline, the Soviets were under more stress, with several neighboring nations in direct conflict. Due to less military buildup, the Japanese were capable of gaining minor border regions against the USSR, supported by a heavy shelling of Vladivostok by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The British and their direct support would also play a role in this northern thrust. Divisions from Australia and New Zealand supported the Japanese attack on the land, and in the air, Britain would station bombers in the British Raj and Japan, where they would focus on disrupting supply chains to the front line and destruction of vital infrastructure against the Soviets and the Chinese. With the introduction of the Sadabat Pact into the fight against the Soviets, the British provided support to the less modernized armies of the Iranian and Afghanistan armies. The other 2 members of the Sadabat Pact of Turkey and Iraq were gaining ground against the Syrian National Republic, who were consistently armed by their allies of France and Italy.
getting supplies transferred to them through the Mediterranean Sea. The British up until now had not been able to disrupt this supply chain, as their navy was busy defending the home islands. However, with the Japanese introduction into the Saxon Allies, the Asian navies of the British were now reallocated to Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. The British risked the destruction of the Mediterranean Navy in order to free up their forces to be reallocated to the Egyptian front. While Turkey entering the war had guaranteed their ability to expand against Syria, with the Turkish under threat of losing control of the city of the world's desire, Istanbul. While there was certainly a lot of troops in the Balkans, the risk was calculated, as now the Latin Axis were incapable of importing oil from the Soviet Union through the Straits of the Bosphorus. With the threat of their war effort collapsing without oil, the Latin Axis would divert more troops towards the Romanian front, seeking to seize their oil deposits and formulate an invasion of Turkey to reopen the straits and regain their oil supply. The Latin Axis sought to invite the Greeks into their alliance, but just like in our history, the Greeks utterly refused, seeing Britain as their natural protector and the claims of the Italians and Bulgarians on their land irreconcilable. The Latin Axis would soon invade northern Greece in order to widen their front with the Turkish Balkan territory in their quest to seize Istanbul from the Turks. Despite the Latin Axis's best effort to overwhelm Turkey, it was too late for the young Syrian state. Utterly surrounded and without supplies, the joint forces of Iraq, Turkey, and Britain had managed to capitulate them. Turkey was given northern Syria to occupy and claim for themselves. Britain established the Lebanese and Druze states as buffers between themselves and Turkey, and Iraq claimed the land that remained. With their forces free from managing the Syrian state, reinforcements came to Egypt, halting the Latin Axis's advance and pushing them back to El Alamein, where the Latin Axis would hold out during a prolonged siege, determined to prevent Saxon Allied forces from breaking into their northern African colonies. With the disaster that the Turkish introduction had caused to the Latin Axis, their trump card had to be activated. Spain under Franco was still recovering from the civil war that had erupted in 1937. Only 3 years had passed since the halting of hostilities, and Franco had refused to join the war, as they were not ready for yet another conflict. However, there was no denying the French and the Italians. Despite Franco's best wishes, the Spanish were forced to join the Latin Axis and aid the alliance as they invaded Gibraltar. With Spanish support, Gibraltar fell within minutes, and the Latin Axis had finally cut off British access to the Mediterranean through the Atlantic. The British would not take this lying down, as once the Spanish had joined the war, the British had invoked the Portuguese-British alliance, opening another European land front with the Latin Axis. British and Portuguese forces flooded into the Iberian Peninsula, attempting to quickly capitulate Spain and disrupt the stabilization efforts that the nationalists had undertaken since their victory in 1939, and more troops had to be diverted from the Latin Axis's numerous front lines. The victory that was supposedly so close had been consistently denied by the Saxon Allies and their cunning. The British were overextended, but through diplomatic victories, they have managed to cover their flanks and expose weak points within the Latin Axis. The German economy of this alternate timeline was not nearly as ready for war as the Germany of our timeline. But as this conflict threatened to destroy the very nationhood of Germany herself, the democratic elements of the country have all banded together in total mobilization. While the forces of the Latin Axis had consistently chipped away at their land, the Saxon Allies were finally able to execute their counterattack. The French resistance and the Saxon Allies have recognized the incredibly delicate political situation in France, and soon executed Operation Charles. A French resistance member disguised as a communist successfully assassinated Pétain, leaving the French nation leaderless and without clear succession. The right and left-wing national leagues fought desperately among themselves to push their preferred candidate to leadership within France. Despite the right's best efforts, Marcel Déat had won against the right-wing candidate of François Mitterrand. Marcel had immediately begun his reforms in order to seize total control of the state for him and his supporters. The rightist elements of France, fearing neo-socialism and Marcel's former ties to Moscow, immediately attempted a coup against him, but failed to seize control of Paris. The right-wing leagues and their forces rallied under Delaroque, centered in Vichy, and called upon Italian assistance to oust the communists from France, offering Mussolini Nice, Savoy, and Corsica for their assistance. Mussolini would accept this deal. Mussolini had finally achieved his Greater Italy, but it would not last.
With the Latin Axis in utter disarray, as the former head of the alliance was in outright civil war, the Ustasha of Croatia performed their own coup against the Hungaro-Italian-occupied Croatia, declaring their support for the neo-socialists of France and seeking to establish the Greater Croatia at the expense of their neighbors. This too was orchestrated thanks to Saxon Allied intelligence. These two operations had created the perfect opportunity for the Germans to execute their first offensive maneuver since the war had begun, Unterhemmen Margarethe. German armored units that were diverted from the Soviet front blitzed through the Pannonian Basin, capturing Budapest within weeks. After the seizure of Budapest, the Yugoslavian resistance wrested control from the Serbian puppet state that had been delegated to France following their capitulation in 1939. The German forces soon linked up with the Yugoslavians in Serbia. In one fell swoop, the Saxon Allies had encircled the entirety of the Latin Axis's forces delegated to the seizure of the Balkans and destruction of Romania. After the critical success of Unterhemmen Margarethe, the Soviets quickly attempted their own counteroffensive, Operation Uranus. The Soviets had called upon their forces to quickly expel the occupiers in order to spread the revolution to the rest of Europe. However, the invasion that the Saxon Allies had performed previously was not to capitulate the Soviets, as it seemed previously. The express purpose of this advance was to advance the Dnieper and establish fortifications specifically for the joint operations of Charles and Margarethe. After the initial attempt to cross the Dnieper and break through the Saxon-allied eastern fortifications had failed, the Soviets had then invaded the Baltic states in order to circumvent their defenses. During the invasion, the Lithuanians had joined the Latin Axis, eager to reclaim their territory from the Polish. The Prussian garrison in Germany was quickly deployed to neutralize the threat of Lithuania and protect their exposed flank against the Soviet counterattack. While German-Polish forces were able to reach Riga and fortify the region there, Estonia was not able to be supported in time and capitulated to the Soviet Union. While the Soviets had managed to gain territory and divert Saxon allies from their positions, Operation Uranus had no significant effect on the Saxon Allied advance into the Balkans. German forces blitzed southwards, quickly liberating the land that they had only recently conceded to the Latin Axis. As Yugoslavian troops quickly reclaimed Bosnia and Croatia from the Ustasha, the Austrian state was utterly surrounded. Italian troops quickly evacuated to the Alps in an attempt to protect their homeland. The brilliance of the Saxon allies and their grand strategy had finally been revealed. With the leagues of France in civil war, the French resistance finally executed their revolution, disrupting both the neo-socialist and fascist factions within the state. Saxon allied troops flooded into liberated port cities as the Saxon allied invasion of France had begun, with the Austrian and Rhinish separatist states quickly capitulating without their foreign benefactors, and the British-Japanese invasions of China and the Soviet Union were progressing well. The Saxon allies were finally on track to victory. It was only a matter of time. However, the sins of Britain and their attempt to preserve their empire against anti-imperial forces would soon come to haunt them. December 7th, 1941, a date that would go down in infamy. The Japanese Navy executed Operation I, with a surprise attack on the largest naval base of the United States in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor. The previously neutral United States was in an uproar, and promptly declared war on the Japanese, a member of the Saxon Allies, leading the United States of America to become a member of the Latin Axis. There is no doubt that in our history, Pearl Harbor changed everything. This is true for this timeline as well, if not more so. The previously neutral nation who had had enough of war had become rapidly pro-war essentially overnight. Even without the knowledge that the American public would react this way, the decision of Japan to bomb Pearl Harbor seems incredibly foolish. Why didn't they just let the giants sleep? Once you understand the logic of the decision, it makes a lot more sense. The USA had been supporting the Kuomintang since the First Revolution, and it had not stopped after the Second Sino-Japanese War.
supplying arms to the Chinese via trade between their intermediary, the Philippines. Fearing the US joining the war to protect Chinese sovereignty, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in hopes to eliminate the United States Pacific Navy before the war had begun. Soon after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, they began an invasion of the Philippines, using the element of surprise in hopes to cut off the Americans from their largest Pacific naval base. They managed to quickly secure the island. The Field Marshal of the Philippines, Douglas MacArthur, had evacuated, saying his famous quote, "I shall return." In response to this, the United States Congress had immediately declared war on the Japanese, upon request by Roosevelt. However, he did not request that Congress attack Britain. Why? In our history and in this alternate timeline, Roosevelt was extremely amicable to the Allies. In this timeline, the British-Japanese alliance would concern Roosevelt, but he could tolerate their collaboration as the Saxon Allies fought the dictatorships of Europe as one. However, the British-Japanese alliance would not stop the Americans from their support of the Republic of China. In their eyes, China under Chiang Kai-shek was a young nation who had dreams of becoming a democracy. Due to the USA not bending on their desire to support China, the Pacific War was unavoidable. Roosevelt had hoped to keep the Americans out of the European War, as if the Americans were to support the Latin Axis unconditionally, they'd be actively participating in Europe's fall to communist and fascist dictatorships. So Roosevelt would not request Congress to declare war on the British or the Germans. The refusal for Roosevelt to declare on the Saxon Allies caused the American public to be outraged. America was founded on an anti-British revolt, and now we're letting them get away with supporting the Japanese? And while the Germans were democratic, the resentment that the average American had felt for the Hun during World War I was still haunting the American zeitgeist. Notable intellectuals like Carroll Quigley had the conspiracy theory that many elites in American society were attempting to sell their nation back to the British. While this is vehemently false in both our history and this alternate timeline, this theory would spread like wildfire among the American populace. American industrialists sympathetic to the ideals of corporatism as espoused by the dictators of the Latin Axis would support America's entry into the European War, wishing to emulate their government. MacArthur had finally reached America, and as he did, he told the American media that he had seen Japanese aircraft arriving from the south of the island. He asserted that this was due to the British allowing Japanese aircraft to station themselves in the colony of North Borneo. It was due to the southern attack that the Philippines had been lost so quickly, and he demanded that the Americans declare war on the British immediately. This news, whether it was true or not, caused the already tumultuous political situation to become unsalvageable for the Democratic Party. With the Senate and House elections due in 1942, and the public yearning for war against the Saxon Allies, Roosevelt would be impeached, and his Vice President Henry A. Wallace would succeed him. Conditional to his ascension to presidency, the Democratic Party ordered Henry A. Wallace to declare war on the Saxon Allies. In response to this war, the Canadian government executed Defense Plan 1, establishing a guerrilla movement and deterring as much aggression as possible, prior to evacuating their armed forces away from the continent. The National Guard bordering the state regions were quickly deployed and aided in the Federal Army's invasion. The Canadians stood no chance as they were quickly occupied. But why did the British withdraw? The simple reason is that Canada is not a suitable staging ground for an invasion of the States, no matter how much Hearts of Iron 4 you've played. The British have eliminated a front line that their land forces would need to contest with, and allow for them to re-invade as liberators when their existential threats were dealt with. Operation Margaret is almost complete. The Saxon Allies only need to eliminate the fascist Romanian, Bulgarian, and Albanian occupations. Macedonia was reclaimed for the Yugoslavians. The fascist militias of Romania were expelled. The Bulgarian capital had been seized. It was only a matter of time before Albania was captured, and the forces of the Latin Axis were utterly destroyed. While the Italians were able to withdraw a significant portion of their troops from Albania, the majority of them would become prisoners of war, as the Saxon Allies finally secured the Balkans. But now that they had, what were they going to do with the land that they had occupied? Albania would be occupied partially by the Yugoslavians and Greeks, both with desires to partition Albania between themselves. Germany would maintain an occupation of Hungary as they attempted to create a democratic government. Bulgaria would be occupied by several of its neighbors. Turkey was eager to annex the Islamic majority regions into their country, but were under threat of the Yugoslavians,
as in their pan-Slavic fervor, they wished to integrate the Bulgarians into their state. Out of concerns for the stability of the region during this occupational period, these motions were denied. While the Saxon Allies had managed to secure one of the most contentious fronts in Europe in lightning speed, they had floundered regarding the best way for them to proceed with the occupation. This only helped increase the paramilitary activity in the region, with communist paramilitary organizations filling the power vacuum that the Saxon Allies had left behind on their warpath. And while the Saxon Allies had managed to defeat Operation Uranus, the threat of a Soviet push eventually succeeding lied heavily on the shoulders of soldiers and world leaders alike. The Saxon Allies would divert troops that they had committed to Margaret back to their front lines of the Soviet Union, as they began plotting new invasions and potential countermeasures to a Soviet advance. However, they couldn't have possibly predicted what the Soviets were plotting. The failure of Operation Uranus weighed heavily on Stalin's mind. The purges that he had performed to rid the Union of traitors had led to his greatest minds being replaced by incompetent fools. Due to Operation Charles' meticulous planning, and with the narrative of a communist being the assassin of Pétain being accepted by the Latin Axis, the Latin Axis had begun immediately accusing the Soviet Union of attempting to undermine the alliance. In order to preserve their alliance, Stalin had denounced the neo-socialist faction in France and recognized the Vichy government as the true government of France. A very controversial move, but it was necessary. Even if it had meant that their influence had completely dissipated in France, their plans still remained the same. Let the liberals and fascists kill each other. The world revolution would come to judge them soon enough. He would make sure of that. After the Americans had joined the war, they had wasted no time in their collaboration with their new allies, quickly hypothesizing their plan of attack. The main advantage that the British and Japanese had was their access to resources in Asia. Their dominance over the region and their uncontested naval strength led to the British and Japanese being able to quickly transport troops, resources, and other goods to each other with ease. The only threat that the Saxon Allies had to their naval dominance in the region was the isolated colony of Italian East Africa. But recently, the British were able to occupy the colony, leaving the Latin Axis with no naval bases in the region. While victory would certainly be achieved by gaining dominance over the Atlantic, the potential failure of the American Navy could lead to their capability of executing an invasion to fail. In order to secure the ability for the Americans to naval invade the British Isles, they had to destroy the British economy. The Americans and Soviets had created a plan to best facilitate a British economic collapse. The Soviets would blitz southwards, capitulating the Central Asian states and sweep into India, where they would trigger a revolution. The Americans would support this endeavor by dominating the Mediterranean Sea. This would then allow the Americans to seize the Suez Canal, allowing them to move their navy through the canal and bring it into the Indian Ocean, contesting the Saxon Allied naval dominance and supporting the revolutionary effort. With the American entry into the Latin Axis, the victory that the Saxon Allies had been so close to achieving was no longer within their grasp. While they had managed to secure the Balkans completely, their advance into Italy and France were stalling, as American weaponry began reaching the soldiers of the Latin Axis. With the American army soon landing in Europe, the Saxon Allies were anticipating for the main battles of the war to occur in Western Europe. But that assumption was exactly what the Latin Axis were hoping to exploit. The Soviets had played their hand, as they executed large-scale offensives originating from the Caucasus and Central Asia. This unexpected concentration of forces caught the regional armies off guard, as the Red Army began their blitz towards the crown jewel of the British Empire. This sudden advance had begun to show fruit very early. The Caucasus front was especially effective, as the Armenian and Azerbaijan socialist republics were able to expand, much to the delight of their local populations. The Soviets were also able to sway the Kurds to revolt for their independence against their enemies. With such heavy Soviet influence in the local paramilitary organizations, the possibility of them even joining the Union was considered by Stalin. However, they were facing trouble in the Central Asian front. The logistical capabilities of the Soviets had been overestimated, as when they continued to push into the mountainous regions of Iran and Afghanistan, they are continuously raided by the locals, who are experts in guerrilla warfare. Regardless of these setbacks, the socialist republics of Iran and Afghanistan were gaining legitimacy and followers who wanted to see the end of foreign imperialists dictating their foreign policy. This southern thrust was a gamble,
attempting to destroy the weak points of the Saxon Allies, divert their troops, and perform a counterattack. While it was beginning to pay off, the Soviets had lost more of their eastern land to the Japanese. In our history, Japan had supported many different movements against the Bolsheviks in the Far East. While none of them were able to resist the Red Army as they liberated the rest of their country, a large number of anti-Bolshevik Russians had migrated to communities across the world. In this story, we will focus on the Russian fascists of Harbin. It is here that in this city, the Russian Fascist Party would organize, yearning for a Japanese invasion of the Soviet Union. The head of this puppet government was the leader of the Russian Fascist Party, Konstantin Rodzavsky. Konstantin and his party would work with other white Russians like Grigory Simonov under direction from Japan, as they supported the Japanese Imperial Army's subjugation of Russia. While the Russian Fascist Party would be deeply unpopular with the Russians of the Far East, they would gain more and more legitimacy as the Japanese secured key strategic locations, eventually leading to any viable naval port for the Soviet Union in the East being captured, preventing the Soviets from getting any material shipments from the USA via the Pacific. Once the southern thrust had begun, the Russian Fascist Party had consolidated more troops and began small advances further into Siberia. The Soviet Union would enact a policy of scorched earth, preventing the Russian fascists from advancing with ease. While the Soviets could have easily pushed the Russian fascists out of their land, they were confident that this collaborative government of the Japanese would not gain enough legitimacy to seriously pose a threat. Letting them die to attrition in the hospitable land of Siberia would claim more fascist lives, allowing more Soviet troops to be committed to their southern thrust. Due to the lack of American material support, as well as the fading loyalty of the Soviets to the Kuomintang and their cause, the resistance led by Chiang Kai-shek would eventually be subsumed into the reorganized government of China under Wang Jingwei. Leadership against Japanese imperialism fell to the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong. The Japanese gamble of bombing Pearl Harbor had successfully secured China for Japan. The only thing left for the Japanese to do was to defeat the Americans in one decisive battle, and they would destroy the Americans' will to fight. They couldn't have been more wrong. In our timeline, the USA were able to quickly manage to defend their vital island bases in Oceania in order to organize a suitable naval resistance, protect the remaining nations of Australia and New Zealand from Japanese invasion, and were eventually able to gain vital strategic locations before defeating Japan. However, in this timeline, the Australian and New Zealand governments were at war with the USA, and the Japanese did not have to subjugate the rest of the Allied colonies in the East. While the Americans did have a strong Pacific Navy, the Japanese Pacific Navy was larger at the start of the conflict in our history and in this alternate timeline, especially thanks to the damage done by the Pearl Harbor attack. Due to all these factors, the Japanese would manage to, with their allies, subjugate the remaining territories of Oceania under American control, besides Hawaii, which became the Americans' last outpost in the Pacific. Due to the Atlantic Navy's commitments to opening another flank for the Latin Axis fleet against the Saxon Allied dominant Indian Ocean, the Pacific Navy had to be quickly reinforced by plenty of new ships. American labor, united in their struggle to preserve freedom in their and other people's lands, is what gave the Americans the edge they needed in the Pacific War. However, in this timeline, American labor was far less cooperative. While in our history, the motivation for America to perform total mobilization against the Axis was very clear-cut. The dictatorships of the world were desperate to subjugate the globe for themselves, and America was the arsenal democracy. However, America would not become the arsenal democracy. In this timeline, they would be the arsenal of fascism, as while the arms that the workers produced in America could have been used for the war in the Pacific, it was equally possible that these armaments would be used in the War of Atlantic, one that supported the destroyers of democracy. While some may have been convinced of the propaganda that Mussolini, Larocque, and Franco were all reluctant dictators, protecting their countries from communism, it only exposed another hypocrisy, as these dictators began collaborating with the communists under Stalin as soon as they had the chance. The socialist movement in America would gain more and more traction, as their leader, Norman Thomas, was an ardent pacifist. As more and more workers gained consciousness of the great hypocrisy,
as it became to be known, the production capabilities of America in the war began to slowly lose more and more traction. Wallace and his Democrats would appeal to the pro-war nationalists in their attempt to gain more votes following the disaster of Roosevelt. Republicans would attempt to circumvent the socialist movement from gaining more traction by adopting a middle ground. The Republican candidate of Thomas E. Dewey would advocate for a peace with the Saxon Allies, but a continuation of the Pacific War. While he proclaimed that it would be possible to negotiate, the Republican presidential candidate would essentially be asking the nations that they were at war with to abandon one of their greatest allies. For this reason, it would not be as simple as asking. The Americans would need to demonstrate their military dominance in order to come to the negotiating table as a merciful foe instead of a pleading weakling. In order to support the war effort, the Soviet Southern Thrust, the Americans had to win dominance over the Atlantic Ocean. Their first objective was to aid Franco in their war against Portugal. While troops had already made it to Iberia, reinforcing the Spanish line, the Americans did not have time for a prolonged advance into Portugal. In order to eliminate the threat quickly, they needed to support the land front via a naval invasion from behind. And in order to facilitate that, they needed to take the Azores. The American Atlantic Navy had engaged the Portuguese-British Navy in the region and reigned victorious as the damaged fleets of Britain and Portugal returned to the British Isles. With the Azores secure, it was only a matter of time before American Marines invaded Lisbon. With the American entry into the war, the Saxon Allied High Command was scrambling to find a suitable response to the invasion. They had already planned to concentrate more of their forces into a Western European blitz, with the aim to capitulate Spain, regain access to the Mediterranean, and eventually starve out the French and Italians. Now, the Americans were arriving and their plans began to falter. With the southern thrust of the Soviets, the Saxon Allies had begun to see the Latin Axis' plan. By attacking from Asia Minor and northern Africa at once, the Saxon Allies were at risk of losing the Suez and India, the two greatest assets to their war effort. Time was running out, and they needed to make a move quickly. Their original idea of quickly advancing into southern France while the Vichy government was still reorganizing, to open up a secondary front with the Spanish, was still viable, but alternative plans needed to be drafted. Despite having to divert more troops to the Soviet front, the Blitz to Madrid was executed. The initial phase of the Blitz was so successful, the Vichy government had quickly vacated the seat of their government from Vichy to Algeria. However, the second phase had fallen short. The fascist French army had managed to vacate to the east of the Rhone River, preventing an encirclement, and the German advance was halted by the towering mountains of the Alps. With the introduction of the Americans into the World War, things are getting much more tense. The Americans have been humiliated in the Pacific, but are quick to capitalize on the strategic vulnerability of the Saxon Allies. The Blitz to Madrid had failed, and a majority of the Latin Axis troops remained unscathed in the attack. Portugal soon fell to the Latin Axis as they were attacked on all sides. With the Blitz to Madrid falling short, there's no need for the Americans who were committed to the Northern African front to divert themselves. They continued on to El Alamein, which the Latin Axis had held onto since their first failed invasion of Egypt. Now, the American forces were here, under the leadership of Eisenhower. Supported by French and Italian troops, they began to reverse the course of the African War, with the support of the American Navy off the coast. However, the British had their own reinforcements. With the liberation of the Balkans complete, the tank corps of Erwin Rommel reached Cairo, eager to relieve the efforts of Montgomery in their defense of Egypt. These generals, legendary in their efforts in the African front, will now face each other in this alternate North African campaign. However, while the grand battle is going on between the legendary generals in Africa, the British Empire was in crisis. After the Americans had occupied Canada, many within the US government were wondering what to do with it. Many saw the occupation of Canada as the victory that 1812 had meant to be, praised Wallace for his daring, and eagerly encouraged him to annex Canada outright. However, the Canadian withdrawal had been a calculated move, and while they were stalling the Americans' advance, the Canadians were installing resistance cells to perform guerrilla warfare against the Americans. For this reason, any attempt for the Americans to outright annex Canada would only hamper the war effort.
In order to bring Canada into the fold, they had to delegitimize the resistance movement. In order to do so, they would establish ties with potential collaborators. The first and most obvious decision would be to establish a free Quebec. Ever since the 7 Years' War, the French-majority region of Canada had several attempts for freedom or resistance against the British and Canadian rule. With the advent of the American occupation of Quebec, the possibility for a truly free Quebec was finally possible. Many Quebecois nationalists would eagerly collaborate with the American occupiers, hoping that America would listen to their plight and grant Quebec independence. While this was certainly compelling, there was also the potential of the Canadian puppet state to consider. If the Americans were to create a Quebecois republic, the Canadian people would see the Canadian puppet government as illegitimate. Then there is the question of who would lead the Canadian government and what kind of government it would have. Since Canada was a dominion of the United Kingdom and a part of the British Empire, it was a monarchy with a single line of legitimate heirs, the Windsors. Any attempt for the Americans to create a Canadian republic would be a farce and defeat the purpose of the concept of a puppet government in the first place. You may as well annex the entire of Canada as territories. So, if there were to be a Canadian collaboration government, it would need a monarch. Where could the Americans find a claimant to the throne of Britain who's comfortable fighting on the side of fascists and is close by? Well, you'll never guess who the Americans found after they invaded the British Bahamas. The former King of Britain, Edward VIII. The infamous King Edward became King of Britain after his father's death in 1936. However, he would abdicate that same year after refusing to divorce his to-be wife, the twice divorcee Wallis Simpson. After his abdication, he had only fallen into more scandal as he showed interest in Nazi Germany. In order to neutralize the threat of his rival claimancy and sympathies with fascism, he was declared the governor of the Bahamas and was promptly sent there during the Second World War. In this timeline, the story is the same. Up until the Americans seized the Bahamas, anyhow. Once the Americans had Edward in their custody, they gave him an offer that he couldn't refuse: become the new head of Canada and claim his rightful place as the King of the United Kingdom, sovereign of the British Empire. Edward would accept this deal. This rival government had, upon request of the Americans, granted the Quebecois independence, and leased the Canadian provinces east of Quebec to the Americans, which should be used as naval bases for their next move against the Saxon Allies. In order to legitimize the Edwardian government as a British imperial effort, and not simply a Canadian puppet government, Oswald Mosley was appointed Prime Minister by King Edward under a provisional government. While the provinces of Canada would elect their officials to Parliament, as they had done previously, the Prime Minister and his cabinet would not be debated. After Wallis had recognized the Edwardian government as the true government of Britain, the American government had once again gotten their hands dirty by working with fascists. However, this time it was not simply a result of conflicting alliances. This time, it was deliberate. The American government had been selling this Atlantic War to the people of America as a war to end British imperialism. Now, the Americans were sponsoring it, with a fascist at the head of their government, no less. The Americans had pressured Edward into issuing a proclamation in order to attempt to diminish the scandal. This proclamation had guaranteed to the Canadian and American peoples that once he would return to Britain proper, he would give the Canadians the freedom to decide their fate via referendum. This, of course, did not include the rest of Britain's dominions or colonies, and was quickly revealed to be an empty promise, only fulfilling the desires of the American nationalists who sought to unite the Anglo-Saxons of America under one state. America had only become more divided. The socialist anti-war unions grew as disdain for the Democratic Party had risen. Wallis began adopting more and more fascist policies in his attempts to expand the New Deal program. While the New Deal in our history and in this timeline up until this point was not fascistic, it inevitably gained more of a fascistic flavor in this timeline. These temporary, corporatist policies led to small business owners losing their freedoms and wealth, moving more and more to the Republican Party, who advocated for the free market to be restored. However, This would play to the Republican Party's detriment, as the socialists who were supporting Dewey under a united front in order to end the war in the Atlantic began to struggle with the fact that Dewey was pandering to the petite bourgeoisie. The election continued to loom, and America's fate lay in the balance. It was no longer simply an election to preserve democracy in Europe. It was an election to preserve democracy in America. A major thorn in the side of the Americans in their war effort was their naval capabilities of safely reaching the British Isles. As mentioned before, the Americans may have been able to send a large naval invasion to Britain from their homeland, but any action that they would take at this stage would be far too risky. Even the Americans' attempts to aid the Soviets with their logistical issues via Lend-Lease had been consistently thwarted by German U-boats blocking shipments. With the British being comfortably seated right between the Americans and their shipping route to the Soviets, German U-boats did not need to go far in order to utterly destroy any hope for the Soviets to gain American aid. In order to put more pressure on the British, and properly hunt down the submarines that were raiding the American convoys, the Americans needed naval bases. The neutral country of Denmark had Iceland and Greenland under their purview. These colonies were in the perfect position to station American ships in an aggressive and defensive manner. The USA promptly demanded that the Danish concede these territories to them. Once the Danish refused, the USA promptly declared war and quickly seized Greenland. Denmark was quickly brought into the Saxon Allies, and Iceland was heavily fortified by the British. With the Americans slowly closing in on the British position, they needed supplies and their Pacific Navy to come and defend the home isles. Much to the dismay of the Japanese, the British Navy began the long trek home, refueling at the Cape before traversing the Atlantic. With the seizure of Greenland and the looming American advance into Iceland, the home islands are increasingly under threat of American invasion. Fearing American ambitions on their land, and out of brotherhood in defending their kin, the remaining Scandinavian nations of Norway, Finland, and even Sweden all joined the Saxon Allies. With their strong ties to the British and each other, the nations of Scandinavia banded together against the USA and the Soviets, fearing their partition once the American Navy came knocking on the coasts of Norway, or the Soviets began demanding their subjugation, spreading the Soviet forces thinner than ever. Regardless, the Soviets' plan persists, as they continue to march southwards in order to facilitate the British Empire's collapse. While these events in the Levant are developing, more important events are occurring in the southern Atlantic Ocean, as the British Empire continues their slow collapse. We will complete our observations of the British situation before investigating the consequences of the Scandinavian entry into the Saxon Allies, and how the lack of material shipments to the Soviet Union would affect their capabilities of waging war. While the Americans were threatening the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic was very securely under Saxon Allied control. While the North French colonies swore fealty to Larocque's government thanks to Italian troop presence in the region guaranteeing as much, the West African colonies of France had sworn fealty to Free France for a similar reason. Due to British troops being present in Western Africa, these Western African colonies were quickly granted to the Free French government, with a minor exception: the return of former German colonies back to Germany. As mentioned in a previous episode, the mandate system of the League of Nations had been in place to adhere to the principles of the League, while allowing the victors to gain territory against their enemies. The German Empire's colonies in Africa were quickly carved between the British, French, and Belgians. The colonies that the French had seized from the Germans and their associated mandates were granted to Weimar Germany as a gift, and the British had conceded their slivers of territory as a measure of goodwill. While these gestures were certainly appreciated by Germany, it was not without its underlying strategic benefit. These Western African colonies had many German settlers within. The hope was that the Weimar Germans would be able to administer these regions much more effectively and gain the support of the German settlers much more than any British or French government could. German submarines were promptly stationed in the Western African colonies. These subs were granted a blank check to sink any convoys that were headed towards the Latin Axis through the Straits of Gibraltar. This wreaked havoc on the Americans' war efforts in Iberia and Africa, but it also agitated many neutral nations who were doing trade with the Latin Axis. In order for the Latin Axis to fuel their war machine, they needed rubber. The largest exporter that was willing to trade with the Latin Axis was the Republic of Brazil. Brazil was neutral, but significantly ideologically aligned with the Latin Axis, as Brazil was currently under a dictatorship under Vargas. While in our timeline, despite Brazil's ideological similarities to the Axis and Vargas's pro-German leanings, he had joined the Allies. This is due to two different reasons, which are up for debate. The first, more orthodox opinion is that he joined the Allies after they were convinced that the Axis had no hope of winning. The second, less orthodox one, was that the USA was planning to invade the Brazilians if they had refused. Yes, this is our history, by the way. War Plan Rubber was drafted by the Americans in the event that they had to neutralize Brazil before joining the Axis. These fears were justified due to Vargas's aforementioned Axis leanings. The goal of War Plan Rubber was to quickly seize the northern naval stations and airports, denying the Axis these vital strategic positions. While the plan made some logical sense, the logistical capability of the USA to execute a naval invasion of this scale was weak, even in our timeline, where the Allies controlled most of Western Africa. However, the USA would still have been preparing for the potential of Brazil refusing to join. In this timeline, there would be no need for an American invasion. With similar ideological tendencies, cultural similarities, and having their foreign trade disrupted by the Saxon Allies, Vargas's Brazil would join the Latin Axis, enabling the Americans to dock their navies in their ports. While the alignment of Vargas's Brazil was to be expected, the Saxon Allies were not expecting them to join the Latin Axis directly. Thankfully, the Saxon Allies had a countermeasure in place for this exact scenario. The Saxon Allies would aid liberals in Brazil in staging a democratic coup against Vargas's Brazil. The coup was mostly successful, with many Brazilians recognizing the democratic government. However, there were still many in Brazil who adored Vargas, and with the aid of the just stationed American troops, were able to organize a resistance against the democratic movement. The Saxon Allies would send many of their troops stationed in the colonies to support the democratic Brazilians in their struggle, as the fate of the Saxon Allied war effort hung on the balance. With the advent of the Brazilian Civil War, and fears that in the event that the democratic movement in Brazil would fail, the United Kingdom would be without their vital supply line to and from India. Due to this, the British executed a mass withdrawal of food and supplies from India. India would suffer a devastating famine. This happened in real life, and was an extreme tragedy. However, in this timeline, it would be exacerbated by the divergences. With countless nations banding together against British imperialism, the Indian national movement would gain more and more traction. Confident that the British would be overwhelmed by the Latin Axis, and emboldened to take action as their countrymen suffered British imperial plundering, Subhas Chandra Bose would lead a revolution against British imperial rule and aligned himself with the Latin Axis. This revolution would gain massive support in the rural, Hindu-majority areas under direct British rule. However, the princely states would mobilize their retinues against Azad Hind, wishing to restore order and continue British rule in the subcontinent. The Pakistan movement would align themselves with the British as well, because if Azad Hind were able to succeed in the revolution, their chances of gaining their nation would be extremely slim. While the Azad Hind movement would be gaining momentum, they lacked the arms to properly resist British imperialism. While the Soviets would transport troops, weapons, and more through lengthy air routes and smuggling arms to the Himalayas, it was not enough. The Soviets were desperate to make a land connection with Azad Hind in order to ensure the economic collapse of the British Empire. With the Indian revolt ongoing, the British had to defer more and more of their troops away from the support of the Japanese invasions of the Soviet and Communist Chinese. Japan was incredibly disappointed with the British and their performance in the current crisis. Many within Japan were wondering if it was worth continuing to work with the British at all. The Japanese had already managed to convince the British to transfer their occupation of Vietnam to them. While Free France had wished for this colony to be returned, it had already been agreed that a new order would be established in the region. Japan had established the Empire of Vietnam and negotiated a Siamese entry into the Saxon Allies by recognizing their claims in Indochina. However, the move of Japan supporting Siamese irredentism had brought much worry to the British, as the remaining irredentist claims of Siam had involved gaining land against British colonial holdings. This diplomatic move by Japan was tolerated by the British simply because they could not afford to do anything in response.
the British naval presence in the Pacific had rapidly diminished, and their land forces were scrambling to formulate a response to the Indian Revolution. This move by Japan was a feeler to see how weak the British were. Japan then gained the confidence to ask for leadership of the Saxon Allied war effort in the Pacific. This would mean that instead of following the orders of the British in concert with the Japanese, the Australian, New Zealandic, and other British colonial forces would be under the direct command of the Japanese. Due to Britain being overwhelmed by the unrest in India, this request was granted as a temporary measure until the Indian stability had been properly dealt with. Japan had gained an unprecedented amount of influence in Asia, and they would run with it for as long as they could. The collapse of the British Empire seems inevitable, as any and all movements against their rule were united against them. And with the American Navy slowly constricting the freedom of movement that the British Navy had enjoyed for centuries, many had expected the United Kingdom to sue for peace nearly immediately. However, British stoicism had won out, as Churchill would repeat his famous speech from our timeline, in this timeline. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." But of course, this latter half from our timeline would not be the same. The British Empire was not in the comfortable position that it was in our timeline. Instead, he would proclaim that the Saxon Allies, with German air, the Free French's seized navy, the resolute Czechoslovaks, and the rest of the nations that were under the banner of the Saxon Allies would rally together in order to free Europe from the yoke of dictators and defang the perfidious Yanks from spreading their tyranny across the world. Rommel and Montgomery faced an overwhelming force of American, French, and Italian troops. They managed to seize a favorable position on the western bank of the Nile Delta and are primed to seize Cairo and therefore the Suez. During these incursions, the Indian revolt had begun, forcing the Americans to move their timetable up. The Suez needed to be captured soon. Due to this haste, the American general of Eisenhower had attempted to quickly blitz through Cairo. However, Rommel and Montgomery had performed a daring counteroffensive, which encircled a large number of Latin Axis troops. Attempts of reinforcement were defeated in detail by Rommel and his tank corps, and while morale for the Saxon Allied troops was high, these victories had meant nothing if the Soviets were able to reach the Suez. While the Latin Axis' Egyptian campaign was floundering, the Soviets had taken it upon themselves to reach the Suez. The weak armies of the Middle Eastern nations were quickly subsumed by the Red Army, and while logistics were a concern, they were supported by the local populations who they had promised freedom to, like the Kurdish. Iraq, under Rashid Ali al-Gailani, had seen the strength of the Red Army and seen British influence across the world quickly vanishing. With the Soviet southern thrust, it seemed like they were dead set on spreading the revolution as far as they could. However, Stalin would also acknowledge the realities of the war itself. This southern thrust was a perfect opportunity to spread communism to the Middle East, but it was not the proper time to do so. Spreading communism would require large Soviet garrisons for vital things like suppressing counter-revolutionary partisans, overseeing elections, and enforcing collectivization. After the collapse of the British Empire, oh by the way, the Soviets weren't imperialist. They totally weren't imperialists, you guys. After the collapse of the British Empire, these troops were needed elsewhere. So, the Soviets would get in contact with the Iraqi Prime Minister and promise that with minor territorial concessions to a new Syrian state and the Kurdish in their northern territories, they would respect Iraqi independence and support their claims against the British and even the Iranians. This deal was too good to pass up. Rashid Ali al-Gailani would execute the Golden Square coup with the aim of destroying any and all British influence in the state and align themselves with the Latin Axis. The garrisoned Saxon Allied troops in Iraq were quickly enveloped as the nation that they were defending betrayed them at the flip of a coin. The southern thrust had managed to reach the Persian Gulf, providing them the vital strategic location that they needed in order to continue the invasions of Iran and Afghanistan to connect with Azad Hind, and commit more troops to the Levantine front, where they rapidly approached Damascus. After the capitulation of the Syrian National Republic, the Saxon Allies had erroneously granted Damascus, the former capital of the state, to a Druze state. These tensions had only exacerbated the already prominent Syrian resistance movement, as they romanticized the former SSNP and their ideology. When the Soviet forces were seen just outside Damascus, the Syrian resistance had triggered the Damascus Uprising, where they clashed with the garrisoned Saxon Allied forces in order to re-establish their state with Soviet support. However, the Soviets would simply watch as the SSNP's last chance of reclaiming the country were dashed. But why would the Soviets ever do this? Well, in our history, Warsaw had a similar uprising against the Germans, but it was not supported by the Soviets. This is because the resistance movement in Poland was associated with the Allies, and if they were to succeed, it would go directly against the designs that Stalin had for Eastern Europe. So, in this timeline, just like our history, the Soviets would wait for the resistance that was aligned with their reactionary allies of convenience to die before they marched in and established a new order of their own, an Arab Syrian republic with a heavy Soviet influence. While the Soviets would explain to the Latin Axis that these measures were taken to ensure the stability of the region and the continued collaboration of Iraq, they were appalled. One of the first members of the Latin Axis was viciously demolished by the Soviets. The policy of continuing to collaborate with the Soviets became a terrifying prospect, as the European members of the Latin Axis began fearing that they would share a similar fate once the Saxon Allies were destroyed. In order to prevent this fate, Spain, France, and Italy would look to America for their assistance in rooting out socialism. Their advice was simple, and influenced by the narrative of the great hypocrisy wearing down the war effort back home. Reform your countries to become more liberal, and the Americans would ensure that the threat of socialism would not harm their way of life. Thus, one by one, the nations of the Latin Axis would liberalize, with or without the consent of their dictators. First comes Spain. Franco's regime was barely performing the basic necessities for their state to operate. The troops that they had designated to establish order in the unruly regions within their state were quickly diverted to the Portuguese front. In response, separatist states like the Basque and Catalonians were yearning for independence and were attempting to align themselves with the Saxon Allies. This had only gotten worse, as while the German blitz to Madrid had failed, the Saxon Allies were able to directly aid the separatist states, as they were right next door. Seeing the failures of Franco, the threat of separatism destroying their war effort, and with the Americans garrisoning Spain and Portugal anyway, the Americans would ensure Franco's assassination. After the death of their beloved Caudillo, totally not orchestrated by them by the way, the Americans would establish an Iberian state, known as the Iberian Commonwealth, with a constitution and federative model inspired by the Americans' form of government. This new government had the support of liberals and effectively destroyed any significant popular support for the Basque and Catalonian separatist rebellions. While America would sell this revolution back home as a victory for democracy, the people of Portugal and Spain would be very dissatisfied with this turn of events. The Falange and Estado Novo far right of Spain and Portugal would attempt to reverse this course, and the Carlists would soon go into hiding. After the advent of Iberia and the uprisings of the Falange, Mussolini had quickly begun mobilizing the fascists to stop working with the Americans. The black shirts and armies were ordered by Il Duce to turn on the Americans. This brought Italy into utter chaos, with American garrisons against the Saxon Allied borders in Europe and Africa falling to infighting. The Stalinist cells that had been fermenting under orders of Stalin had feared that they would be exercised as well, so many had activated in response to Mussolini turning on the Americans and Soviets. The next day, Dino Grandi would betray Mussolini by encouraging the king to reclaim his constitutional authority and depose Mussolini. After his deposition, Mussolini would flee and attempt to establish an Italian social republic, but the American presence in Italy ensures that any attempt of an organized revolution is quickly quelled. Mussolini was soon captured and sentenced to death by the king. During the chaos, the Saxon Allies had managed to occupy everything north of the Po River, and quickly propped up a rival Republican government, and granted claimed lands of the Germans and the Yugoslavians from the Italian lands to themselves. After the deposition, it would be easy to assume that the fascist movements would dissipate alongside Mussolini. However, thanks to Grandi's betrayal of Mussolini, he was able to keep the public's perception of fascism in a much more favorable light. While the dictatorship would be over, the Acerbo laws would still remain as a temporary measure to ensure the stability of the state, with promises that full democracy would be established following the end of the war. While there were still many fascists that were on the side of Mussolini, many were quickly subsumed into the new order under Grandi, as their fears of Saxon Allied occupation and the deposition of their beloved monarchy were much more important to them than loyalty to Mussolini. The Rock quickly saw the writing on the wall and a promise to the French people that he would restore democracy. The Algerian government had shifted from a one-party dictatorship to a provisional government, with promises of an election once the mainland was liberated. While this seemed like a benevolent move, it was once again an attempt for the far right to preserve their ideology in a world where the Americans and their democratic movements had significant influence over them. The rightist leagues would unite to form their own party and would essentially dominate any election, as socialist parties were banned and liberal parties were significantly disenfranchised. The exact specifics would never truly be cared for in the eyes of the Americans, as at home, these liberalization movements would be espoused as America's greatest achievement to the war so far, and promised that they would continue to spread democracy to the democracies of Europe. Yeah, the great hypocrisy would continue to diminish the public's support of the war effort, as while the nations had liberalized, the far right in France and Italy still had significant influence over the state, and the Edwardian government was housing the fascist British movement. The Republican promise of establishing a peace of the Europeans had become much more appealing, as now if the Americans were to perform a limited peace deal with the Saxon Allies, the Americans would not have ensured the continued existence of dictatorships in Europe. However, this also emboldened the pro-war factions, as they now did not have to fear the great hypocrisy as much as they had before, and would have much more to gain with the major nations of Europe all being dependent on the American economy. The Saxon Allies are reeling with the loss of Iraq and the further incursions of the Comintern and Latin Axis towards the Suez. While the progress of the Indian National Revolution had stalled, the success of the Soviet Southern Thrust had meant that the oil that Britain had control over in Iraq and Iran were now no longer included in their possession. The calculated withdrawal of resources from India had also included several tons of oil. The Saxon Allies would receive this oil, as the British Pacific Navy had successfully transported this vital resource to Europe. This oil is the last that they would get from Asia, and they had to make a move in order to re-establish their supply, or the war would end. The only hope of regaining their oil deposits was to gain them through a land invasion. They would commit more troops to the Anatolian front, with two major aims: cut off the Soviets from their advance into the Levant, and seize other former British possessions in Iraq and Iran. In concert with this Anatolian invasion, the German, Polish, Romanian, Baltic, and Scandinavian nations would execute a massive invasion of the USSR, attempting to exploit their overextension and eliminate the threat of communism once and for all. They began their blitz, with key targets focusing on the elimination of industry, resources, and vital supply hubs. But there was one city that had to be captured at any cost, one that was vital for their plan. A city which housed significant industrial capability, a railroad that supplied not only the Caucasian front, but was vital in the supply of the Central Asian front as well. This city was named Stalingrad, the City of Steel, named after their leader, Stalin. This city must be captured for the Saxon Allies to prevent their fall. It is not an exaggeration to say that the victory of the Saxon Allies rests on whether or not they can seize Stalingrad in time. In our timeline, despite how false it was if you had read his book, Hitler was seen as a liberator to the non-Russians of the Soviet Union. However, those ignorant of Hitler's ambitions would soon understand his intentions as, they did things I can't talk about here. Since the Polish had occupied a large majority of regions that they had ambitions towards in the past, many in Poland had wished to claim these territories for their state. However, that would go against the Germans' preferred outcome of having an independent Ukraine. Kiev had been managed to be captured by the Saxon Allies a long time ago, and due to the prowess of the Ukrainians, had managed to withhold the Soviet advance well beforehand. Now, the Saxon Allies had managed to push well beyond the Dnieper. Many Ukrainians had hoped for an independent state. However,
Due to the aforementioned ambitions of the Polish, they had sought to integrate the Ukrainians into their Międzymorze, under the ambitions of their legendary general Pilsudski. As the Saxon Allies comprised of the remaining members of the League of Nations, they had sought to fulfill the ideal of self-determination for all peoples, and these Polish ambitions were, to many, veiled attempts at achieving their irredentism. However, the Saxon Allies are well aware of the consequences of not providing your allies their claimed lands, as Italy had fallen to fascism after their mutilated victory. A compromise had to be made for the continued collaboration of the Polish and Germans. The Germans were willing to provide Poland their ambitions to integrate the Ukrainians, but many measures had to be taken before this would be permitted. For one, the Polish would need to provide the reforms necessary for such a large demographic change to not lead to destabilization to occur. Much to the dismay of Polish nationalists, the minorities of their nation were given substantial rights in anticipation of the annexation of these large territories. But yet another concession had to be made. Germany's claimed lands must be conceded back to them. To many in Poland, this was unacceptable for many reasons, but the primary one was that they were radically devoted to the ideal of Poland, and the idea of allowing their lands to be partitioned under any circumstance was seen as a bridge too far. The Germans were well aware of this. It would attempt to alleviate Polish concerns of the reclamation of Prussian lands by retracting their claim to Poznan, and instead only wished to reclaim Danzig in its entirety. If the Polish were to do this, the Germans would recognize the Polish claim to their Międzymorze and provide them the occupation of Lithuania as their new Baltic port. The negotiations were tense, but in the end, the Germans reclaimed Danzig and the Polish proclaimed the Międzymorze. This proclamation had deeply upset the Ukrainian nationalists who had been fighting vehemently on the Saxon Allies' side up until this point, with the expectation of an independent state. However, this resistance would not amount to much, and the Saxon Allied advance into Russia would continue. Along their warpath, those who would defect from the Soviets to the Germans, like Andrei Vlasov in our history, would do the same in this timeline. And another very prominent Russian would support the Germans fully in this timeline, rather than only under duress. Vladimir III, Krylevich of Russia. Vladimir III was one of the only remaining Romanov claimants to the throne of Russia after the Bolshevik execution of the royal family. In our history, he would speak words of support for the German invasion of the USSR. However, when the Germans had demanded that he issue a manifesto encouraging Russian emigres to support the Nazi invasion of the USSR, he refused. This is most likely due to the fact that he would have been against their designs on his homeland. In this timeline, the Germans' only goal is the destruction of Bolshevism, not the elimination of Russia and those who call it home. Therefore, in this timeline, when the Germans would request his influence in the war against the USSR, he would accept. With all these Russian collaborators on the side of the Saxon Allies, they would have an easier time occupying the region than our history. However, there were still countless of citizens of the USSR who had been relentlessly fighting for and vehemently believed in the ideal of communism. So the Saxon Allies would still face significant resistance, even if it was slightly diminished. While the war in the southern Atlantic was progressing, the remaining Latin American nations who had not aligned themselves with either faction were eventually swayed by America to turn on the British and their allies. The Venezuelans joined the Latin Axis in exchange for their claims in Guyana and against the Dutch to be recognized, leading to the Latin Axis declaring war on the Dutch and the Dutch joining the Saxon Allies. The Caribbean outposts were quickly occupied as the last European colony in the Caribbean had come under America's influence. The Saxon Allies' gamble of supporting a liberal Brazil was beginning to fail. In order to attempt to gain a better strategic position and extra support, Britain had offered the Falklands back to Argentina in exchange for their participation of the war on their side. However, the Argentinians had no confidence in the Saxon Allies to win their war. Instead, they joined the Latin Axis, ensuring the demise of the liberal resistance in Brazil and the seizure of the Falklands back to Argentina. With the success of Barbarossa, the Soviets were desperate for any US assistance in order to aid their war effort. Due to the occupations of Japan and the Saxon Allies' control of the Bosphorus Straits and the Baltic Sea, the only remaining naval port that would be able to accept US shipments is Arkhangelsk. As mentioned in a previous episode, the German U-boats were restricting this possibility. However, now the Americans had Greenland under their occupation, they would invade Iceland, enabling the stationing of their navies in Reykjavik for easier convoy protection and a much more favorable position for a naval invasion of the British Isles. British anxiety would increase as their enemies were slowly closing in on their homeland. But their navy had been concentrated in the defense of the homeland instead of being spread all over the world, so they were prepared to intercept any form of invasion. In order to best ensure the defense of their homeland, they would need to defeat the US Atlantic Navy. The fighting was close, but with the strategic positioning of Britain and Norway allowing for air support to not be dictated by carrier ships, the US Navy was forced to retreat. The Saxon Allies would continue to dominate the Northern Sea, and the Soviets were without any meaningful support. While the Saxon Allies would celebrate their victory, the Americans would execute another plan in order to assist their allies. While the Americans were not able to directly support the Soviets, they would support them indirectly by executing a large invasion of France. Supported by a naval invasion in the western coast of France, the Americans would push the Free French government all the way to the Seine. While the Saxon Allies had anticipated this maneuver and had made appropriate countermeasures, they did not anticipate the sheer strength of the American forces. Another factor to the Latin Axis' benefit was the Latin Axis aligned partisans. Yes, ironically enough, the resistance would face resistance, especially after Larocque had promised democratic elections again. The previously united resistance movement of restoring democracy had suddenly turned on the Free French government, seeing them as collaborators to the Germans and wished to ensure the sovereignty of the French state. With the brutal strength of the Americans, now with their sphere of influence in Europe secure with the liberalization of their European allies, it had seemed to many that the fate of the Saxon Allies was secured. However, the fate of Europe would be in the hands of the American voters, as the election between the pro-war Democrats and anti-war Republicans was looming. Henry Wallace and his Democrats would face Dewey and his Republicans in a presidential election. While the socialist movement had grown significantly, Norman Thomas had advised all socialists to vote for Dewey, as by doing so, they would prevent more bloodshed and ensure that the Democrats, who had begun to grow a fascist sympathetic wing of their party, would not gain any more influence over America. While Roosevelt had been extremely popular and the longest acting president in the history of the United States, he was barely voted out in the 1944 elections. This was extremely unprecedented, as the American populace had never voted out a president during wartime. However, Roosevelt is not the Democratic nominee. Henry Wallace was, and he was not nearly as popular as his predecessor. Due to all these factors, Dewey would win in the 1944 elections and become president-elect. During the transitional period before Dewey's ascension to presidency, the American armies in the European War would stand by as a measure of goodwill prior to peace negotiations between the Americans and the European Saxon Allies. Tensions are high as the negotiations begin in Switzerland. The fate of Europe now lay in the hands of the diplomats, and not the soldiers. But would they succeed? While the Saxon Allies and Latin Axis would discuss fervently, there was one major concern that trumped all of these disputes. Would Germany and Britain agree to sell out their ally of Japan in exchange for peace in Europe? Germany was in favor of such an agreement. Peace in Western Europe would mean that they would be able to commit all of their forces to the destruction of the USSR. However, such an arrangement would cause Britain to lose their empire in its entirety, as India and the Edwardian government were key members of the Latin Axis, and their claims would need to be respected. While the USA could ensure that the Edwardian government would only claim British colonies in the American continent, India would not budge until the entirety of the subcontinent was under their control, and America had agreed to such an arrangement. There was also the matter of Italy's claim to empire. They wished for all of Egypt, Sudan, and some extra territorial concessions to their Italian East African colony, which would need to be restored. While British colonies in Africa and Oceania, in theory, wouldn't be touched, their empire would have shrunk an incredible amount, and the Germans would have gone away with an increase of the size of their country, nearly restoring themselves to the glory of the German Empire of old. Germany would find Britain's apprehension incredibly hypocritical,
as now the British suffered the same fate as the German Empire. But the British would not listen. They would stonewall any measures that restricted their empire's size, demanding the destruction of the Edwardian government and the restoration of their empire with only few concessions at the very least. While the negotiations and ceasefire between the Saxon Allies and Latin Axis were ongoing, the Germans were given a great advantage in their push eastwards. More assets that had been assigned to the Western Front were sent to the Eastern Front as the German forces marched to Stalingrad. The Soviets did not need spies to know that this city was the main objective of their advance. They too recognized the incredible strategic position that it provided to their southern thrust, so it was heavily fortified by troops. However, that would not stop the Germans from entering the city. The Soviets were fighting harder than ever before to protect the city of steel. Soviet generals soon began drafting plans for an encirclement of the German forces in the city, hoping to turn Stalingrad into a trap for the German forces. For now, the Germans were unaware of this potential risk and continued their assault in the city, hoping to secure it fully before the negotiations hopefully succeed. While Britain's desperate claim to their empire would restrict negotiations significantly, there was also the matter of American loans to consider. After the World War, America had granted significant loans to both nations in different ways in order to rebuild their economies. It had even gotten so contentious that the USA and Britain would have significant decline in relations, as Britain was desperate to get rid of American influence in their economy. While the Americans refused to change the loan interest on the British loans, Germany had its burdens lessened due to the Dawes Plan. But now America was paying the price of their graciousness of limiting the severity of the German loans. America demanded that the Germans and British pay back their loans, plus significant interest as war reparations. The British and Germans utterly refused such demands, as it would essentially allow for America to dominate their economies without needing to occupy their countries, essentially no different than a total occupation of them. Ultimately, due to these irreconcilable differences, the American-Saxon Allied summit would fail, and Dewey would return home to America having broken his primary campaign promise. Dewey's failure to secure peace was an incredible humiliation to America. While the pro-war faction would be grateful that Dewey at least attempted to ensure America's national interests and refused to lay down and accept Saxon Allied demands, those who had sympathy for the Saxon Allies would be outraged. Norman Thomas and the Socialist Party of America would be especially outraged, as the preferred candidate to establish some level of peace had refused to fulfill his campaign promise. In response to this failure, the Socialist Party of America would call for a general strike, with the only unnegotiable demand being the American withdrawal from the Atlantic War. While the notion of a general strike sounds incredibly concerning for America, the SPA would have only gained a small amount of extra influence in the state, meaning that the general strike would only take effect in the larger industrial regions with more unions, like Chicago. The communists in America would actually support this general strike, despite the fact that the Atlantic War continuing would allow for the Soviets to avoid the fate of being destroyed. They also saw this general strike as a perfect opportunity to stage a revolution and spread communism to America. That, and the conservatives have already lumped them in with the socialists anyway, so a united front had to be established. While the general strike was concerning, Dewey would not trigger a federal response to the strike. His concern was, if he were to order the strike to be forcibly quashed, a revolution would occur and destroy America. However, Dewey's inaction would only make things worse, as now the pro-war Democrats were organizing paramilitaries and cracking down on left-wing demonstrations. The pro-war Democrats would see Germany as the orchestrator of this general strike, as currently, the SPD in Germany were leading, and the Socialist Party of America shared similar aims to them. This would convince many in America that there was an enemy within, a socialist enemy, that had to be rooted out at any cost. Because of Dewey's inaction to suppress the strike, the public's opinion of the Republican Party would vanish overnight. This event is deeply traumatic for America. Even if the Socialist Party of America were to stand down eventually, the damage has already been done, as America drifts further and further into fascism. Despite this strike, the Americans commit fully to the war once again in an attempt to assert themselves and get a better deal out of the peace negotiations. After news of the negotiations between Britain and the USA for peace in Europe, Australia and New Zealand had felt incredibly sidelined. Thanks to Edwardian propaganda, they had been erroneously told that Britain would have abandoned them in order to preserve their regime in Britain. This would have allowed Japan to take Australia and New Zealand as puppet states without any contest. At this time, Australia and New Zealand were extremely xenophobic, with Australia having White Australia laws in place to avoid Asians from settling in their state. The idea of being abandoned by their king when they had been such loyal soldiers in the Battle of Gallipoli was infuriating. Thus, Australia and New Zealand both would pass laws to recognize Edward as their true king, and immediately swore fealty to the Edwardian government. By attempting to avoid their destiny, they had played right into the hands of the Japanese, as they diverted their troops and navy to occupy Australia and New Zealand. If they were to succeed, there would be no stopping Japan from performing similar exercises in their allies' colonies with the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. However, this sudden turn of events is exactly the opportunity that the Americans were waiting for. The Americans quickly went on the offensive, seeking to link up with Australia and New Zealand to begin their island hopping campaign, and they did so with great success. This is mostly because Japan lacked the oil to supply their ships, as the Southern Thrust's success also destroyed their oil supply. As more and more Japanese troops were diverted away from garrisoning their flimsy puppet regimes in China and Russia, communist resistance cells were triggered as the second phase of the War of Resistance began, this time with the direct collaboration of Russian and Chinese partisans. While initially, Alexander and Barbarossa had succeeded, they quickly realized that they had overextended. The peace talks with the USA granted the Saxon Allies an opportunity to push further into Comintern land. But now that the USA had resumed their hostilities, the USA was able to gain a huge advantage, as the Free French government is pushed out of Paris, and the Americans begin attempting to march into Germany proper. In an attempt to circumvent the natural defenses of Alsace-Lorraine, the Americans would invade Belgium in order to pass the Ardennes. With these sudden advances into France and their slow incursions into the Rhineland, more and more troops had to be diverted from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. The Germans would hastily retreat out of Stalingrad, being sure to blow up any vital infrastructure on their way out. The Soviets had been on the back foot for far too long. While the Southern Thrust was the great victory, the Saxon Allies had continuously occupied their country. No more. With insurrections happening in Siberia, the resumption of Latin Axis and Saxon Allied hostilities, Operation Alexander stalling, and the lack of a Japanese advance, it was time, finally, to execute the Soviet counterattack, Operation Bagration. The Germans are caught off guard by the Soviet counterattack. The siege of Leningrad is broken. The Russian fascists are pushed further east. Soon, all foreign occupiers will be expelled from the motherland, and the revolution will spread to Eurasia and soon the world. The workers of Stalingrad soon continued their endeavor to produce arms for the motherland. The steel factories were quickly brought into operation, and while the occasional bombing run would fall, they were used to such harassment. Even before the Germans attempted to capture the city, bombers were frequently sent as a way to attempt to disrupt the steel production of the city. Their desperate attempts to suppress the workers' state were pitiable, as these liberated workers would endure any hardships for the sake of the workers of the world. However, this bombing run would be the last to soar over Stalingrad. On May 1st, 1944, International Workers' Day, war changed forever. German bombers dropped their secret weapon, the first atomic bomb, Fenrir, on Stalingrad. The city of steel became the city of ash within seconds as Fenrir consumed the city. The railway station, the steel factory, vanished. And those who worked inside and those who were defending the city were either dead from the explosion or soon to die due to radiation poisoning. The experimental weapon of the Germans was deployed with results that exceeded their greatest expectations. Now, the world would tremble before the might of the Saxon Allies, as the German Wunderwaffen were unleashed against their foes.
The Soviet troops that had just completed their southern thrust in its entirety were coming back to the homeland to drive out the German invaders. They had been on quite the adventure, meeting people from faraway lands, and with the pleasure of spreading communism to the local populations. These soldiers were jovial of their victory, but were determined to protect their homeland from the invader. They knew that this force would be unlike the under-equipped armies of their southern neighbors. They faced the full might of the industrialized Germans, where tanks would fight tanks, instead of tanks fighting infantry. It would be difficult, and many of them would die, but it would be for the good of their home, the Soviet Union, and the workers' revolution. They knew it would be difficult, but nothing could prepare them for what they saw. On their way to the Western Front, they were approaching Stalingrad. They saw with their own eyes the first nuclear detonation, but they could not comprehend it. It was a large explosion, almost like a second sun that had touched the earth. Is this the enemy they fought? An enemy capable of destroying cities with one bomb? Despair washed through the soldiers of the Union, but it soon turned to hatred. Hatred for their invaders, who would decimate cities for the sake of victory, who would unleash unspeakable horrors to suppress the communist revolution. First, let's roughly go over our history's Manhattan Project. Out of fear for the Nazis developing nukes, Albert Einstein sends a letter to the Americans urging them to develop this weapon before the Nazis do. The Manhattan Project begins with research by Einstein being developed by scientific figures like Oppenheimer and Fermi. By obtaining uranium from local mines and through trade through the Belgian Congo, they were able to test their nukes in the deserts of America before deploying them against Japan. Here's why in this timeline, the Americans do not develop the nuclear bomb first, and instead, the Germans do. In our history, Germany had been making great strides towards developing a nuclear bomb. However, there was a movement in Germany where many German scientists would accuse those working on anything nuclear related as traitors to their race, since nuclear science was Jewish science. While never directly sponsored by Hitler, this movement had all the hallmarks of his ideology, leading to many in Germany being discouraged from pursuing these scientific advances further in order to avoid being persecuted. Another major factor that would restrict the Manhattan Project's progress was that Enrico Fermi would actually stay in Italy instead of leaving it. In our history, he left Italy due to their introduction of racial laws. However, there is speculation that these policies were adopted to appeal to Hitler. This would therefore restrict the involvement of one of the key scientists on the Manhattan Project to collaborate with Americans only after their introduction to the war on the Italian side, as well as all the bureaucratic restrictions that come with it. In this timeline, the Germans and British would be directly collaborating in this research. German and British scientists would perform experiments in the distant colonies of Africa where uranium was mined locally, in order to properly develop a nuke. For this reason, Britain is also a nuclear-capable power and is currently developing their bomb, hoping to coordinate their nuclear strike to best support the war effort. The advent of Britain becoming a nuclear power was celebrated by Churchill as his finest achievement, and proof of his proclamation of a reclamation of the British Empire would be supported by the Germans and the rest of the Saxon Allied alliance. He would flaunt the threat of a nuclear bomb on the American capital, or perhaps the collaborator king of Edward would prefer a solar coronation. These threats were made in an attempt to show strength, but in truth it showed British weakness more than ever before, as they threatened the lives of their own rightful subjects in exchange for victory. This weakness would soon be exploited, as a plot is brewing in the home isles. The nuke was deployed against the Soviets for several reasons. One major factor is that the Saxon Allies would feel relatively guiltless by doing so, as the Soviets were hated by everyone. It's not hyperbolic to say that the capitalist world saw the Soviet Union as a threat to their way of life, and thus would be extremely motivated to eliminate the threat. While Germany was hoping to nuke a more vital city like Moscow, Weimar was deployed at Stalingrad as a way to ensure the strategic interest of the advance into Stalingrad, being the denial of the railway connection between Moscow and the southern thrust, without requiring troops to be present to do so. Now that the city was a smoldering waste, the Germans did not have to fear the haste of the Soviet troop movements northwards, and allowed for an advance into the oil-rich regions of the Middle East. The reaction to the deployment of the nuke was very mixed within the Russian collaborators. Many believed in the German reasoning, that being the tactical destruction of a vital supply line and major industrial destruction. To many, they could look past the nuke as a means to ensure the death of Bolshevism, but the other half would see it as completely unnecessary loss of life. Russian collaboration would decrease, but not be rid entirely. While Russian history shows that the enemy can even take their capital, but the Russians would still leave it in ashes to prevent their invaders of victory. This felt different. It wasn't their choice. Stalin had ordered no step back to secure the land that they had reclaimed, despite the rumors of Stalingrad being completely eviscerated. But in truth, upper leadership was terrified. Many within the Union sought to see Stalin as some other, who did not care for the lives of the Russians. Defeatism began to spread, and the Soviet Union was in chaos. This chaos is exactly what the Saxon Allies were hoping for, as they began to regain an oil supply. After the diversion of Soviet troops away from the Anatolian front to secure the defense of Stalingrad, and their subsequent annihilation thanks to the nuclear blast, Operation Alexander was able to gain a significant amount of territory in a short amount of time. The local collaborative forces were soon enveloped by the Turks, as they completed the encirclement of the Caucasus, in concert with the German troops, who were able to reach the Volga River. The Soviets inside the encirclement were quick to surrender, or quick to flee to the mountains, where they would organize bitter resistance to capitalism. These advances regained Saxon Allied access to oil deposits. While many had been destroyed prior to capture in order for this vital resource to not be obtained by the Saxon Allies, there was at least enough to neutralize their oil deficiencies. The Saxon Allies would work tirelessly to gather as much oil as possible before an eventual counterattack against the American forces, who, despite the advent of the nuclear bomb, began to advance on their positions. After the peace negotiations had failed, the Latin Axis in Africa had attempted to take Egypt for a third time. This time, they would succeed. Rommel and Montgomery both agreed that a controlled retreat had to be executed as soon as possible. Thanks to the recently reoccupied Saxon Allied land in Syria, they were able to retreat to Europe instead of being isolated in Africa. While the American forces were incredibly fast in their blitz towards the Suez, the Saxon Allies had managed to blow the Suez Canal before the Americans could prevent its destruction, ensuring that the Latin Axis would not be able to maneuver their navy through the Indian Ocean like they had hoped. However, there would be no need to hastily remove the rubble, as the Indians were able to completely secure the subcontinent for themselves without the aid of the Americans. While the Soviets were secretly hoping to establish Pakistan as a buffer state between India and their sphere of influence in Asia, they would hastily withdraw from the region and transfer it to Azad Hind as promised. Eventually, the Latin Axis would occupy all of Egypt and move up into the Levant. This would cause Alexander to stall further, halting just before the great mountain ranges of Iran. The sight of Saxon Allied troops on their border, and with the Soviets' hasty retreat away from India, the Iranian resistance had gained confidence that now was the time to rebel against the socialist collaborators. This event was a great boon for the Saxon Allies, who were able to commit more troops to the new Levantine front with the Latin Axis, who expected a large attack from the south in an attempt to deny the Saxon Allies their oil supply in order to win this war of attrition. However, by this time, the general strike had been called. Their previously gratuitous supply chains were stretched thin between the Atlantic and the Pacific War. This weakness was observed by the Saxon Allies, and they would begin executing their counteroffensive. In America's haste to assert themselves once more, the Germans were able to push through the American advance in an alternate Battle of the Bulge. The armored units of the Germans were eager to yet again establish a free France. But as they entered northern French territory, they noticed an irregular amount of troops present. They had attempted to notify their British allies, but it was too late, as the Americans began a naval invasion of the British Isles, with the American Atlantic Navy being able to be supplied to the north and south of the British Islands. The main objective of the Americans had been unveiled. Their goal was to capture Britain for the Edwardian government prior to peace negotiations with Germany. If they were to succeed, there would be no leniency in their peace. The loans of Britain and Germany would fall to them. The secessionist republics would be enforced. The army would be crippled, and nobody would be able to withstand the American New Order. It was the final battle, one that would decide the fate of Europe. The invasion was overwhelming from the outside, but it was also overwhelming from the inside, as many members of parliament within the United Kingdom had betrayed Churchill, seeing his policy of aligning themselves with Germany as an affront to the empire, and his stubbornness to not surrender to the Edwardian government would forever cement the United Kingdom as second fiddle to the Germans. For these reasons, Latin Axis sympathizers would attempt a coup in London, with the goal of swaying the general public to the side of the invaders. This treason was quickly snuffed out at the epicenter, but was effective in other regions, as the Americans had gained a beachhead in Cornwall and Scotland. The Saxon Allies quickly flooded into the home islands, as the unfortunate realities of Winston Churchill's speech became true. Britain would fight on the beaches, fight on the landing grounds, the fields, the streets, and the hills. But they could only hope that the final prediction of never surrendering would be true as well. The Britons, who had been working tirelessly to defend democracy in the empire against the perfidious Edwardians, whose only legitimacy came from the perfidious Yanks' scheming, were soon facing the full realities of war. The Royal Air Force and the Navy had been able to keep Britain relatively protected against any bombing runs that the French had given them, but now they were facing the full force of the Latin Axis. With support from the Edwardians, the Americans launched D-Day, but to many loyal Edwardians from without and within the home isles, they would call it Operation Excalibur. Indeed, the Georgians may as well change their dynastic name back to Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, as day by day more and more land of the British Empire is lost, and the influence of Germany within the Saxon Allies grows. Even the Georgians' resistance against the rightful Edwardian restoration were being supported by German troops, quickly attempting to reinforce their would-be puppet Britain. How could the Edwardians not elect this conflict to the great battles of King Arthur, King of the Britons, who fought off the Saxons in their settlement of the British Isles? King Arthur may have been vanquished, and the Saxons had colonized England, but now, the Britons have a second chance to right this historical wrong and expel the Germanic invaders out from the home isles, as they both meet in Salisbury, where King Arthur was vanquished, for a battle that would decide the fate of the world. As the Edwardians advanced into Salisbury, the British Home Guard had fortified the city heavily to withstand the unprecedented advance of the Americans' puppet regime. The city would hold out as they desperately waited for reinforcements to come from their allies. The situation was incredibly perilous for the Georgian government. Churchill would outwardly impose a stoicism and faith of their victory, but the British position was incredibly weak. Due to the lack of oil reserves prior to the American invasion, the UK fleet had to be mostly docked in order to save their oil supply in case of emergencies like this. While the Saxon Allies had managed to seize the oil-producing sectors in the Middle East, they had not transported the resources back to the British Isles, which would take a considerable amount of time. In an attempt to capitalize on this weakness, the Americans and British both had attempted to get Ireland on their side, each offering Northern Ireland as compensation. When Ireland had remained neutral, Latin Axis intelligence had triggered a fascist coup, mirroring the actions that they had taken in Britain, but this time with much more success. The former democratic government had gone into exile in Britain proper, as the Latin Axis occupied Ireland in its entirety. The Saxon Allies knew that this invasion was a last-ditch attempt to assert American dominance prior to a secondary ceasefire negotiation. They believed that if they were able to hold out for long enough in the British Isles, they would be able to eventually turn the tide by dominating the North Sea with the British fleet that had remained on standby once they could become active again.
An alternative to this threat was the consideration of deploying tactical nukes to eliminate supply capabilities before pushing out the invader. This was deemed highly unacceptable, as if the Georgian government were to nuke their own citizens, it would cause a massive uproar and sway the entirety of the general public's opinion towards the Edwardian government. Nuclear strikes on America were considered, but given the distance that bombers would need to fly safely and the incredibly high chance of interception, it was unfeasible. Instead, the British nuke would be deployed on the Eastern Front, with the hope that with another nuclear strike, the Soviets would soon capitulate. With the Saxon Allies' desperate attempts to reach Baku, the Soviet soldiers were sent to cut off the Saxon Allies from their main supply chain by seizing Azov. A large offensive was undertaken, but the Saxon Allies had managed to hold out. Normally, such an offensive would have been a death knell for the advancing forces. But after 5 years of war, destroyed infrastructure via bombings, fighting a war on 3 to 4 fronts, a lack of American supplies, friendly Russian collaborators, and a nuclear-capable opponent, the Soviets were exhausted and without suitable arms to resist the Saxon Allies any further. The counteroffensive was cut short, as Stalin had ordered the remaining forces to defend Moscow to the last man and continue their policy of scorched earth. The Soviets' goal was to divert more troops away from the Siberian front in order to defend the homeland. Their hope was that the partisan efforts within Japan's sphere of influence would eventually lead to their downfall, especially with the Americans gaining a vital strategic location in the Pacific with the advent of the Australian and New Zealandic defections. These troops would begin mobilizing en masse throughout the railway systems to reach the homeland. The Saxon Allies were aware of this strategy and began a pincer movement, beginning their attempts to encircle the entirety of the Soviet capital in order to cut off any further supplies or reinforcement prior to deploying the British nuke against the Soviet capital. With the Saxon Allies encroaching further into Soviet lands, many civilians had had enough of the war. The indomitable spirit of the Russians had been infused with the belief in communism, but now people were beginning to become ambivalent to class struggle and would rather live in peace than constant class warfare. For these reasons, when Leningrad is once again encircled, the local garrisons surrender within days, not eager to withstand yet another siege and terrified of the rumors of Stalingrad's vaporization. As Stalin began ordering for the destruction of local industries to avoid them getting into the hands of the Russian collaborators, Stalin was eventually couped by traitors within his government who wished for the war to end. These elements of the military had done so in fears that the Saxon Allies would nuke Moscow like they had Stalingrad, and saw the leniency with the citizens of Leningrad as a sign that surrendering to the Saxon Allies would be the best way to ensure the livelihood of their citizens at the end of the conflict. Stalin and his loyalist cabinet would attempt to vacate quickly to Tomsk in order to establish resistance against the Germans and British. However, he would be recognized on his way there by the locals, who would be summarily executed as they gave him the punishment that he had threatened his soldiers if they had taken one step back. This total surrender had the Saxon Allies splitting Russia between their two rival governments. On paper, the Japanese puppet government of the Russian fascists would gain everything up to the Urals, while everything west of them was given to the Saxon Allied democratic elements. However, in reality, there was incredible, unprecedented amounts of resistance. From the armies encircled in the Caucasus and the populations that were still loyal to communism, throughout the entire Union, they would not surrender, even without leadership from Moscow. The main difference between these two rival governments was their capability to deal with the resistance. The European Saxon Allies were lenient and merciful where possible, but the Japanese were ruthless and took no prisoners. And while the history of exactly what took place after the occupation of the USSR had been poorly documented and without any true consensus as to what happened after the surrender, there was one thing that was certain: how it ended. The final battle of the Atlantic War raged on, and while the USA was making significant gains, news of Soviet capitulation reached the soldiers on both sides of the conflict. This news was incredible to hear for the Saxon Allies, as their victory drew nearer and nearer, but was also devastating for the Latin Axis, as now the Germans would be able to divert all their forces towards their nations. The British and their nuclear bomb had not been deployed, and now could be used against the Latin Axis. There was a significant potential for the Saxon Allies to gain a total victory in the continent. Not only that, but the general strike at home was causing significant unrest, with local unions now brandishing weaponry against the vigilante Minutemen, who were determined to destroy the enemy within. Dewey was put in an impossible position. He was being pressured by the pro-war faction of his country to continue pushing the advantage and secure Europe for America. But every day that he refused to negotiate terms, he risked allowing a communist revolution to rise at home, which would guarantee the Saxon Allies total victory in Europe anyway. Despite the anxiety, he persistently told the people of America to restart work, and they would leave the conflict once the rightful King of Britain sat on his throne. These efforts were completely in vain, as they did not accept the Edwardian government in the first place. And while the Germans were capable of nuclear strikes, the Americans were in the midst of developing their own as well. While it would not be nearly as complete as the bombs of our histories, the Americans still had a few of the scientists that helped create the bomb. American high command was convinced that if they obtained a similar weapon to Fenrir, they would be able to tactically deploy it and secure Europe for themselves. However, things changed after the Soviets collapsed. The Germans were able to commit all their forces to the battles in Britain and Europe, with Britain boasting about their nuclear bomb and the extremely high possibility that Germany could manufacture more. The decision of whether or not to stay and fight in Europe became much more simple, especially when Germany had offered to betray Japan. It is no secret that the Germans had no love for the Japanese in this timeline. The introduction of Japan to the Saxon Allies was a measure that was truthfully only in the service of the British. It was a major malefactor to the German economy, when the Kuomintang were subjugated by the Japanese, as the Chinese Republic was a major trading partner with Germany, and with the event of a Saxon Allied victory, Japan would ensure that these goods would come with heavy tariffs as they solidified their economic control of their puppet. And, of course, the main problem. The only reason why Germany was at war with the USA was because of the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now that, at least on paper, the Saxon Allied Russian Empire was in control of all of European Russia, there was now a reason for Germany to go to war with Japan. Support the Russian Empire in their reclamation of Siberia. Germany would be in favor of such an arrangement, as it would vastly improve their relations with the Russian government, and that's very important when you consider that they had just nuked them. However, this limited peace would come with several conditions. Many of these conditions were outlined in the 1944 peace talks, but were updated to suit the new situation. Germany demanded that the original plans of having a split France and Italy between Saxon Allied and Latin Axis aligned governments to be respected. Even without Free France controlling northern France anymore, they would need to accept their restoration. This is an unnegotiable demand due to Germany's strategic interests of creating a buffer state between themselves and the Latin Axis. Germany had also demanded that the Americans withdraw entirely from Britain and stop supporting the Edwardian government's claim to Britain. With the war reaching the home isles, there was now no demanding any sort of imperial restoration by the Georgians, so the previous malefactor of British chauvinism would no longer be in the way of peace negotiations. However, the Irish fascistic government would remain and keep control over Northern Ireland. Due to Britain and their weakness, the possibility of appeasing the Italians' claims on Britain was now finally possible. Germany would allow for Italian claims on British colonies to be respected and withdraw support for the Ethiopian government, allowing for the Italians to reclaim their empire. But in exchange, the Suez would need to remain as an international zone and not controlled exclusively by the Latin Axis. The majority of Britain's Oceanian colonies would be signed away, but Dutch control over the East Indies and British control over Malaya would need to be respected. These resources were vital for the economies of the Saxon Allies and would need to be accepted by the Latin Axis for any sort of coordinated attack on Japan to occur. The Latin Axis would accept the Saxon Allies' designs on their former allies' lands of Bulgaria and Hungary. In the end, Bulgaria and Albania would be integrated into Yugoslavia, and the Romanians would seize the eastern bank of the Tisa River, with the rest becoming a supervised state of Germany. And lastly, the Americans would need to accept that there would be no war reparations on either side of the conflict. While this deal was mostly one-sided, it all came with the addition that Germany would turn on the Japanese, opening another front with them and their allies in the West, and neutralize the threat of a communist revolution in America. For all of these reasons, Dewey would accept this deal. Peace has finally returned to Europe. As America had accomplished their mission of eliminating threats to democracy in Europe, and the Germans declaring war on the Japanese, they could now focus all their assets to the Pacific War. The USA continues to win major naval battles against the Japanese, especially with reinforcements coming from the Atlantic Navy reaching the Pacific. Any resources that Japan could have possibly extracted from Siberia are thoroughly denied, as German and ROA soldiers establish order in Siberia. The communist resistance cells that had been fighting Japanese occupation would be America's greatest ally in overthrowing Japanese dominance in the Pacific, but would never collaborate with any Germans due to the unspeakable horrors that they had inflicted on the workers of Stalingrad. This would play to America's benefit, as if the Germans were able to reach further into Siberia, they would grow much more powerful. In order to prevent the Saxon Allies from gaining too much land, America would support Mao Zedong and his liberation movement, as well as any Soviet-aligned separatists in attempts to create buffer states between the Germans and American spheres of influence in Asia. With all of Japan's former allies turning on them, and the full force of the Americans surrounding their island, a brutal firebombing campaign would begin. Entire villages, made completely of wood, would be destroyed. This is around when America would have dropped their bombs on Japan, like our history. But their bombs were still incomplete, with no successful tests to be deployed. Therefore, instead of 2 nukes leading to a cooperative Japanese emperor, the Americans would navally invade Japan instead. They would succeed in capturing the south of the island as they began to attempt to secure it in its entirety. However, this also led to a communist Japanese uprising in the north to occur at the same time. Both the communists and Americans would quickly occupy Japan, with America managing to capture the seat of the empire in Tokyo, dividing Japan between an American occupation and the communist Japanese Republic. As Germany continued to push into Siberia, the communists of the Far East would unite to prevent any further attempts to suppress communism and resist capitalism. With the aid of the Americans, the reorganized government of China would dissolve and be transferred wholly to the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong. This would prove extremely fortuitous to the Americans and their designs against allowing German influence to reach the Pacific, as the Far Eastern communists would work together with Mao Zedong in order to push back German troops. While they could not prevent the Germans from taking vital cities like Omsk, they were able to resist German imperialism and stop their advance. With no way for Germany to reach the rest of Russia, it too was back into the hands of communists. But by then, the war was over. The Chinese and others managed to defeat the Japanese Empire. The world was finally at peace by 1946. At last, the conflict was at an end. The Second World War would take the lives of millions, soldiers and civilians alike. In the homeland of the major powers, there was a sense of great jubilation, but still a sense of dread. As for many, the conflict was not over. The peace between DC and Berlin was all but in name a ceasefire, with influenced governments splitting previously whole nations into 2. Italy was devastated, but France was eviscerated by the scars of war. A civil war and 3 large offensives saw many previously brilliant cities falling to ruin. The previous hegemon of the Latin Axis now lay ripe for the superpowers of the world to repair their nation, in turn for their subjugation to these titans. The Saxon Allies had managed to defeat their foes, but cracks within the alliance are beginning to show. Barely holding on until the end of the war, the border disputes and ideological rifts between the core members of the Saxon Allies were now impossible to ignore, and yet they needed to keep themselves together, lest they be divided and conquered by DC. The public in America had become permanently scarred by the general strike of 1945. Even until the end of the conflict, the local police forces were struggling to properly re-establish control as communist cells are fighting for their lives against a democracy with no tolerance for socialism. And despite the peace, conflict is still raging across the world. Communist resistance in the Russian Empire, chaos in the Middle East, separatists fighting Azad Hind, and more anti-colonial sentiments in Africa are all intensifying. And soon, a breaking point will be reached, and the potential for another world conflict looms in the balance. However, the human race cannot withstand another conflict, as any future conflict guarantees the destruction of civilizations across the world, as these superpowers both have nuclear weapons. Weapons of destroying entire cities with one detonation. The Germans would produce more after the Americans successfully test their nuke in 1947. The survival of the human race would depend on their ability to keep a cool head and keep the war cold. But could the Americans afford to allow communism to fester in Eurasia? After America's victory in Japan, the Second World War was finally over. The American troops would come home to their wives and live in peace. But there was an incredible feeling of shock as the American troops would come home. They were celebrated as heroes, sure, but the praise that they would hear would be intertwined with a nationalist fervor. There was no talk of how they spread democracy and protected the rights of every man and woman to be free in the world. Instead, the praise that they would hear would be one that would encourage them eagerly to take the plunge into hell once again. The America of this timeline is completely antithetical to our history. After Dewey had signed peace with the Europeans, the pro-war Democrats were outraged. The general strike had ceased, but not without extreme punishment. After the socialists called for the strike to cease, the communists had persisted. With the labor movement divided, the federal government suppressed the strike and branded the CPUSA as treasonous traitors, with Earl Browder facing the death penalty. After the end of the strike, American industry was once again war capable and proved to be vital for securing victory in the Pacific. But America has blood on its hands. In its struggle to secure itself from foreign invaders, it has tainted its character by consorting with fascists. This taint would grow, giving the fascist sympathizers in America legitimacy, instead of discrediting them. Companies who in our timeline traded with the enemy were only supporting their allies. This taint would grow and fester into an infection as the far right in America rallied under Charles Lindbergh, who no longer attempted to hide his fascistic sympathies. 2 years after the war ended, 1948, Lindbergh utterly destroyed Dewey in the elections, gaining a major majority in Congress and the Senate. And in the next 4 years, Lindbergh would slowly cement his rule and implement his vision for America as the light of liberty begins to flicker away. After the League of Nations had failed to preserve peace, the Saxon Allies were attempting to reform the League to be more influential. Just after the war had ended in the Pacific, Dewey had done his best within the last year of his term to attempt to preserve peace in the world. He would invite the Saxon Allies to found a United Nations together, with the goal of allowing each nation of the world to settle their disputes through international law. This would manage to succeed. However, after Dewey would leave office and Lindbergh would take charge, the United Nations was mostly neglected by the Americans. However, they would remain within the United Nations as not to alarm the nations of the world and ruin their diplomatic position. While Dewey was attempting to establish a détente of the Saxon Allies, Lindbergh would flare up tensions as he expanded the scope of their collaboration with their allies in Europe. While America had joined the Latin Axis, the true scope of the alliance had far exceeded its original intention. The previously European-centric alliance was now completely subjugated to the United States of America, and their previous fixation on far-right ideologies was now, at least on paper, no longer a concern for the alliance. Thus, the Latin Axis would reform into the Central Atlantic Treaty Organization, CATO. All previous members of the Latin Axis would join CATO as they sought to expand their alliance, hoping that the new name and fundamentals would help appeal to more prospective nations. America's allies of Europe, the formerly fascist dictators of the Latin Axis, were stuck in a strange state of limbo. In many ways, they had been humiliated utterly. Their nation's borders had been maliciously malformed to suit the whims of foreign nations. But in other ways, they have gained greatly. With the advent of the war ending, reconstruction efforts began, heavily supported by American capital. These flimsy nations would begin to stabilize and recover, uniting with one another economically. The European members of CATO would begin to cooperate their economies as equal partners, laying the foundations for what would be known as the Latin Union, an economic union between the former members of the Latin Axis. The Italians under Grandi would, as promised, revoke the Acerba laws. The first free elections of Italy would occur soon after the war had ended, and resulted in an Italian fascist party victory. The remaining political parties would assert their desires of less governmental interference in the economy, but would not provide any meaningful resistance. In truth, the democracy of Italy was a farce. Nothing had changed. This would begin the struggle for true democracy in Italy, as the Saxon Allies would support any anti-monarchist movements with the goal of removing royal influence before potentially uniting Italy. However, this would be far beyond the horizon, as the Italians had begun an economic boom thanks to American investments, significantly affecting any destabilization attempts by the Saxon Allies. The Vichy France regime, which we will now be referring to as Southern France, would be the most destitute member of CATO. With constant warfare along the entire countryside, the only truly preserved city was Marseille, which would become its new capital. Dilleroc's party of this townland became the dominant party in the mainland, much like the Italians had, providing them some stability. However, it would take a long time for France to truly be relevant in geopolitics on both sides of the dividing line. The Iberian Commonwealth became America's playground. With America already controlling the Atlantic islands and Gibraltar, historically Iberian land, these annexations would be justified as a way to ensure America's continued protection of the European allies. Even Malta would become an American territory. The popular support of the Iberian Commonwealth was incredibly small, as American troops operated their garrisons and American capital would prop up the young state. Controversially, the Saxon Allies would fund far-right movements in Iberia in an attempt to weaken the Americans and their presence in the Mediterranean. The Irish situation was much like the Iberian one. However, the Irish would have far more experience dealing with foreign occupiers. The Saxon Allies would support the Irish Republican Army, but also support Northern Irish paramilitaries, who would fight against both the American puppet government and the IRA. The Saxon Allies would attempt to keep the peace between these two insurgents, while the Americans would attempt to sow dissent wherever possible, as to divide and truly conquer the island for themselves. After the Second World War, the Saxon Allies were in an extreme zenith of prosperity. With the scientific breakthrough of the nuclear bomb, Germany had begun harnessing the power of the atom for energy purposes and began spreading this newfound prosperity to its allied nations. The Free French, now to be referred to as Northern France, and the German Republic would perform a plebiscite in Alsace-Lorraine, splitting the province along ethno-linguistic lines. The British would face a political shift radically towards social democracy, as the legacy of the Conservative Party would be forever tarnished by those who were pro- and anti-Churchill, as Churchill was not able to reclaim the empire and the last remaining conservatives had nearly doomed British democracy. Thus began the era of Labour dominance, where the United Kingdom would slowly decolonize and shift to a pro-German policy. Due to so many things going Germany's way, there was a period of complacency within the Saxon Allies, as they had faith that the Americans would participate in a status quo scenario as previously pitched by Dewey. However, the Americans had successfully deployed their first nuke and Hindenburg had come to power. The Saxon Allies had to react. In response to the founding of the Latin Union, Germany and her close allies would pursue a pan-European union for themselves. This European Union would have a parliament established in Cologne, rather than Brussels like in our history. The grandfather of Europe, Charlemagne, had groomed Cologne to be the center of the Frankish Empire. It was only fitting that Cologne be selected, for historical and symbolic reasons, to be the center of the European Union, as now there would be no debate as to who was their leader. After the founding of the European Union, many of the states of the Saxon Allies had joined. However, the founding of the European Union had solidified the destruction of the alliance. The Mid-de-Morse, also known as the Intermarium, and Romania would refuse to join the EU and began to distance themselves from Germany by leaving the Saxon Allies. The Polish feared that Germany would dominate them economically if they had joined, and they wished to assert their independence. This sentiment was shared by Romania, as the Yugoslavians had annexed Bulgaria into their state, threatening Dobruja to be claimed by them. Romania and the Mid-de-Morse would deepen their alliance, with increased trade between the two powers. With the divide of Poland and Germany, Czechoslovakia was caught in the middle. Their natural course would be to align with Poland. However, the influence that Germany holds over the country is immense, so much so that they would attempt to become neutral as to avoid any backlash from either party. In order to pressure these nations that refused to join the European Union, the German Republic had announced the foundations of the German People's Associations, Deutscher Volksbund. These associations would be established in countries that housed significant German minorities, like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, the Intermarium, Baltic countries, and Russia. While on paper, these associations would have no purpose beyond protecting German minorities within Europe from oppression in their homes, in reality, it would operate as a tool for the Germans to ensure that these states would remain under their influence, using the local populations as organized pressure groups against any anti-German stance. States that had already joined the European Union would accept the directive and aid in the foundation of these institutions. However, the eastern states would recognize the true motives of the Volksbunds. Poland and Romania would both refuse the establishment of Volksbunds in their states, but Czechoslovakia would agree. This is due to the large German minority in Czechia. This way, the Czechoslovaks would keep their territorial integrity and maintain some level of neutrality. After the distancing of the Intermarium and Romania, and natural distancing of Turkey and their Sadabat Pact, the remaining Saxon allies had to form a new alliance to suit the new political situation. Germany, Britain, northern France, northern Italy, the nations in the Benelux and Scandinavia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Russia would found the Association of Democratic Nations in 1949. Regardless of the defiance of Poland and Romania, the Germans were still incredibly prosperous, thanks to their economic union, sure, but also due to their close ally of the Russian Empire. Russia has been liberated from Bolshevism. Their people are free, but they are destitute. The official narrative is that it's a natural consequence of communism and is temporary. However, the assets of prior Soviet corporations are now in the hands of German investors without much sign of a middle or upper class having room to develop in Russia. The Volksbund system was expanded to a greater extent in Russia under the Germans' reconstruction efforts. This is due to the treatment that Stalin had given their local Germans after they had gone to war. Stalin exported many Germans to labor camps in Siberia. Some would still remain in Siberia under the Soviet successor government, but these Siberian Germans are specifically being allowed to resettle, and by doing so, strengthening German influence in Russia. Germany would oversee the reintroductions of the Volga Germans back into their homes, and ensure that the new Russian government would provide significant autonomy to the Germans there and the rest of the country. With German dominance over Russian resources and industry, extreme political influence, and heavy influence on the local German populations, Russia in its current state is a Reichskommissariat, all but in name. But you know, it's not imperialism because they're like liberal, right? Well, not exactly. The Russian constitution was liberal and had many liberal parties, but Russia's politics would be dominated by one man in one party. Vladimir and his Russian People's Party. Vladimir would become the first elected prime minister of Russia, solidifying his grasp of the country. He would perform some socialist-leaning reforms, often leading far into what most would consider communistic. However, it was all in efforts to assert Russian independence and limit German influence in their state. Another example of Vlasov's attempts to circumvent German influence in Russia was the refusal to join the European Union. While they were invited, Vlasov had argued that the Russian economy had not recovered enough in order to properly join the Union without causing instability. He also cited German apprehension to continue hostilities against the communists of the East as reason to be concerned regarding German intentions with Russia. Vlasov would privately assure the Germans that he had the intention to join the European Union after Russia was stable and unified, but never made any promises in writing as to keep his options open. With these political moves, Germany began to distrust Vlasov and would attempt to improve the democracy of Russia with further constitutional amendments and support of other pro-German parties. Regardless of the attempts to mitigate and increase influence, there was no doubt that the Germans were here to stay for a long time, as any animosity the Russians may hold for their German puppet masters was much less than they had for their foes in the East. After the communists had managed to liberate East Asia from Japanese imperialism and withhold the German advance into Siberia, the war-exhausted Germans had signed a peace with the communists of the East, recognizing the Siberian Soviet Republic. After this, there was no debate regarding who was in control. The Chinese communists under Mao Zedong were finally able to bring peace to the proletariat of Asia. However, there was still much instability for the communist movements of the East. Firstly, while China was united under one party, the CCP, lands that it had claimed were still not in their influence. America had supported the CCP in their struggle against Japan, but the support ended there. The island of Taiwan continued to be occupied by America, with no promises of unity with the mainland. The lack of authority in many regions like the western provinces had led to Uyghur separatists supported by the Germans. Secondly, the Siberian Soviet Republic had no cemented leadership. These were several prominent figures from local politics, and some remaining old USSR leaders, but due to the political instability, were not able to solidify their regime, and thus were heavily dependent on Mao Zedong for stability. It was clear to Mao that Chinese communism needed to adapt, and thus would take a radically different approach than in our history. In this timeline, Mao Zedong would not proclaim the People's Republic of China. Instead, he would, with the consent of the Siberian, Korean, and Mongolian communist states, create the UESR, United Eurasian Socialist Republics. The Sino-Soviet Union would claim an unprecedented amount of land. Every claim of China's, on top of all the Soviet Union's former territories, as a true successor to their legacy. With support of all the peoples under their protection, they sought to rapidly industrialize with the aid of Russian experience and Siberian resources, to fulfill the ambition of Stalin and spread the revolution to the world. The UESR began heavily investing in communist movements like northern Japan, and supporting anti-colonial revolutionaries in Cato and ADN-aligned nations alike, seeking to significantly improve their position and potentially expand their union. While the ADN would not face the initial wave of anti-colonial unrest, Cato members were forced to dig in and fortify their positions in order to contain the Red Menace. The Philippines, Formosa, and Japan would be under the general administration of Douglas MacArthur. Since Japan is such a vital strategic location in order to contain the UESR from expanding their influence into the Pacific, the military presence in Japan would be much more significant, and the article forcing their demilitarization would not be enforced in this timeline. Instead, the USA would invest heavily into rehabilitating the Japanese army in order to destroy the North Japanese Republic. Formosa would be occupied by America as they contemplated their fate. They could either prop up a puppet regime to destabilize the mainland, or attempt to divorce Formosa from its Chinese past. Regardless, it would remain a heavily militarized island in hopes to best contain the UESR. Vietnam would be transferred back to its rightful owners of southern France, but would suffer an intense guerrilla campaign in the region. However, With America's extreme disdain for communism in this timeline, they would irrationally reinforce the region constantly in attempts to maintain their incomplete blockade. This would only increase tensions with the USSR, as America seeks to bait them into engaging in conflict. This containment policy would spread to Burma, India, and the Himalayas. India would be one of Cato's greatest assets, a recently freed state which is English-speaking and brimming with population. The Americans would fund their state heavily, leading to an earlier Indian industrialization. However, because India contains the entire peninsula under their reign, there are many insurgents seeking to establish states of their own, most prominently Pakistan, who would be continuously supported by the Germans and Turkish as a means of weakening their adversaries of Cato. However, this policy may be to their detriment, as weakening India may give way to a communist revolution in solidarity with the USSR. However, Asia is not the only place Cato has to fear rebellions in, as the ADN begin decolonization efforts. Seeking to cause instability in Cato-aligned colonies, the ADN began decolonization in their colonies. The German League of Nations mandates would expire along with the League itself, leading to an independent Cameroon and Togoland, both with Deutscher Volksbund to protect the settler Germans, of course. Following German lead, the British and Northern French began to decolonize as well. However, the decolonization process would not be nearly as straightforward. Administrators of northern French colonies bordering southern French colonies would defect in exchange for keeping their positions. These territories would soon suffer violent revolutions, causing chaos in Western Africa, fearing decolonization destroying the apartheid regime. South Africa and Rhodesia would recognize the Edwardian government as their true rulers. Them and the exiled Portuguese would soon face anti-colonial revolts as the entire southern cone of Africa becomes a war zone. Even the ADN takes significantly controversial measures by deploying troops in Namibia. The northern coast of Africa remains relatively more stable in comparison. However, significant anti-colonial movements are still present. Egyptian rebels are being supported by the ADN. What seems to be a wise move may end up causing significant instability in the Middle East. Turkey had managed to survive the intense invasion of the Soviet Union and succeeded in Operation Alexander with the support of the Saxon Allies. However, at the end of the war, Turkey had once again turned inwards. Turkey had attempted to transform the Satabad Pact into a greater faction, seeking to protect the newly independent Central Asian nations and function as a neutral bloc, benefiting from the influence of both the ADN and Cato. However, this measure would be mostly misguided, as their allies were far too unstable for Turkey to remain on the sidelines of the conflict. Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan had all only recently recovered from the southern thrust. These countries would be subject to a proxy war that would determine Turkey's alignment, as the USA began supporting a Republican movement in Iran through their connection to India in response to the ADN supporting Pakistani separatism. The ideal of a united Arabia was pursued by the ADN in order to disrupt Cato's attempts of setting up a sphere of influence among the states in the region. The ADN's preferred candidate for unification was Iraq, but they lacked any significant popular support. Meanwhile, the Ba'athist movement was gaining significant traction. Egyptian insurgents were prominently Ba'athists under Nasser, who sought to create a united socialist Arabia. Another reason why the Latin Axis would not support a united Arab movement is that they were Zionists and sought the establishment of Israel as a state, but far beyond the boundaries initially conceived by Zionists. Revisionist Zionists sought to create their state in the regions of Palestine and Jordan, promising autonomy to the locals. However, with the revisionist Zionist movement being established and without much forethought and care, the potential for a Jewish state is threatened by the political maneuvering of the ADN. While the Middle East was not in open conflict yet, the stage had been set for insurgencies. Cato had begun to foment a civil war in a nation critical to the ADN's geopolitical position, Greece. The Greek state had managed to survive the onslaught of the Second World War. They would gain land in Albania and unite with Cyprus, but the expected concession of Rhodes was instead given to Turkey. While the Greek government would not express disdain publicly, the Greek populace had become incredibly disillusioned with the Saxon Allies. As usual, there was a debate regarding the political structure of Greece: monarchy or republic. The monarchy had lasted throughout the war, and Metaxas politics had managed to keep the region stable, but it had the adverse effect of flaring up Greek nationalism to the detriment of the status quo. To many Greeks, it seemed to be that the monarchy was only in place to allow for ADN influence to fester. This nationalistic movement would sway many different political groups under their banner. Inspired by the Dino Grande form of democratic fascism, fascistic parties would unite with Republican liberals against the monarchists. This sudden political shift had led to a civil war breaking out between pro-German monarchists and pro-American Republicans. Greece's position in the Mediterranean was incredibly vital for both the Germans and Americans, as if Cato were to succeed and hypothetically invade Turkey, the newly found access to the Black Sea would allow for the non-belligerent Romanians and Polish to potentially join Cato and crumble the German order. Thus, the first proxy war of the Cold War would begin, but not without responses from the ADN and Comintern alike. Due to the Venezuelans joining the Latin Axis, they were able to expand their influence greatly. However, it only encouraged the reactionary, anti-democratic factions to act earlier than in our timeline. Soon after declaring war, the military would perform a coup in order to ensure the security of the war effort. After the war had ended, they decided to keep these dictatorial powers. In response, liberals began agitating and soon began revolting. These revolts would be directly supported by the ADN as they began their attempts to gain a foothold in America. Seeing the Americans' potential weakness, the North Japanese communists would begin an invasion of southern Japan, in a war that mirrors our Korean War. Douglas MacArthur would do his best to secure all of Japan for Cato, threatening nuclear strikes if the USSR had intervened. This sounds ludicrous. However, in our history, Douglas MacArthur had requested 34 nuclear strikes along the North Korean PRC border in order to ensure their victory in the Korean War. In our history, Truman would dismiss MacArthur. However, in this timeline, the fascist sympathetic Lindenberg would be president. The potential of America to seriously consider nuclear strikes in this conflict is extremely plausible. With the potential of nuclear war on the horizon, how would the ADN react? Would they continue the Russian reclamation against the USSR? Or would they attempt to keep tensions low in hopes to avoid an escalation towards a Third World War? Who would win the proxy wars spreading across the globe? These questions would be answered in Project Stresa Season 2. Talons in Twilight. Revisiting Project Stresa after a break made me realize truly how much of a potential there is for a Project Stresa Cold War. However, with a point of divergence as far back as 1919, it's extremely difficult to speculate in such a rich period of history, so it may be a while before this story is expanded, if at all. However, I would love to hear what you all think about Talons in Twilight. So please leave comments and consider joining my Discord where we can discuss further. While I may not be able to speculate, I did come up with an interesting way to expand on Project Stresa. If you join my Discord and navigate to the announcements channel, you'll see an invite to a Nation Roleplay Discord server for Talons in Twilight. Join the Discord and sign up to play as one of the nations in this Cold War scenario and expand on the fate of the Project Stresa timeline with the community. Who knows? Maybe I'll make a video about what you all make. Thanks again for watching Project Stresa. I hope you've all enjoyed. Please consider sharing with your friends, liking the video, and subscribing if you want to see my next series, Project Bourbon. I hope you all have a good day.